Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. The computer monitor flickered, a brief blue flash that lasted maybe half a second before the screen went completely black. Almost immediately, the video cable slipped from behind the display and clattered onto my desk. The small incident pulled me away from the quarterly report I'd been wrestling with for hours. I pushed back from my chair and peered over the partition of my cubicle. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I was completely alone. The entire floor was empty, save for a few scattered desk lamps casting long shadows across the maze of workstations. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago looked unusually quiet for a Thursday evening. The wall clock near the break room showed 9:47. I had at least 3 more hours of work ahead of me if I wanted to submit the report before the morning deadline. Turning back to my desk, I reached for the loose video cable, catching my reflection in the dark monitor screen. But there was something else in that black mirror, another silhouette standing directly behind me. Martha was there, just as she always was during her evening rounds. Our building's night custodian had worked here longer than anyone could remember. She was a thin woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, always moving with purpose through the halls, her cleaning cart squeaking softly as she made her way from office to office. I didn't turn around to greet her. I could see her clearly enough in the monitor's reflection. She stood perfectly still, watching me work. Martha had always been peculiar about her routines, often lingering in doorways or beside desks as if waiting for something. I'd grown accustomed to her quiet presence over the years. I focused on reconnecting the cable, but Martha seemed to grow restless behind me. Through the reflection, I could see her shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Then I heard it, a soft clicking sound, like someone tapping their teeth together rhythmically. The sound echoed strangely in the empty office space, seeming to come from everywhere at once. My fingers fumbled with the cable connection behind the monitor. The port should have been right there, but I couldn't seem to find it. As I stretched and maneuvered, trying to make the connection, Martha began moving. She took several steps to the left, then to the right, her movements visible in my peripheral vision through the dark screen. The clicking grew more insistent, almost urgent. My hands were starting to shake slightly as I finally managed to push the cable into place. The monitor blazed to life with that familiar blue flash, temporarily blinding me. Instead of sitting back down, I stood and turned to face where Martha had been standing. The space behind my desk was empty. I walked around my cubicle, checking the adjacent workstations, peering down the corridors toward the elevators and the emergency exit. Nothing. No sound of her cleaning cart, no footsteps, no clicking. The silence was absolute. I finished my report in record time, my productivity fueled by an inexplicable sense of urgency. As I prepared to shut down my computer, a troubling thought crept into my mind. What if Martha appeared in the monitor's reflection again when the screen went dark? The idea made me glance nervously over my shoulder, but the area behind me remained empty. Before leaving, I decided to check the custodial closet near the elevators. Maybe Martha was simply restocking her supplies. The small room was locked, and through the wire-reinforced glass window, I could see it was dark inside. No sign of Martha or her equipment. As I waited for the elevator, staring at my distorted reflection in the polished metal doors, a memory surfaced that made my blood run cold. Martha, our reliable night custodian, had died in a car accident on the expressway more than 18 months ago. The building management had struggled to find a replacement who could match her dedication and attention to detail. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and as the doors slid open, I wondered who or what had been watching me work that night. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. This happened to me 3 years ago, and I can still recall every detail because it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I was working as a graphic designer for a marketing firm in downtown Seattle, occupying the 32nd floor of a glass tower that offered spectacular views of Elliott Bay. During regular business hours, our office buzzed with creative energy, designers collaborating on campaigns, account executives taking client calls, and the constant hum of conversation and ringing phones. But after dark, the atmosphere changed completely. Nobody wanted to work late alone, and when overtime was absolutely necessary, we made sure to stay in groups of 3 or 4 people. I had heard the stories, of course. Office chairs spinning on their own in empty conference rooms. Strange shadows moving across walls where no one was walking. Elevator doors opening on floors where no one had pressed the call button. These tales fascinated me. I'd always been drawn to paranormal phenomena, though I never expected to experience anything supernatural myself. On a Saturday in November, my creative director asked me to come in and finish a presentation for a major client. Since it was the weekend, the building was nearly empty, except for the security guard stationed in the lobby. I figured that working during daylight hours would be less unsettling than staying late on a weeknight. I was wrong. The first 2 hours passed without incident. The office was perfectly quiet, which felt strange after being accustomed to the usual workplace noise. I decided to play some music from my computer, just background sound to fill the silence while I worked on the presentation layouts. Around the 3rd hour, something odd began to happen. I heard footsteps, the distinct sound of someone running across the polished concrete floors. The rhythm was unmistakable, the quick, sharp impacts of rubber-soled shoes hitting the hard surface at a rapid pace. My first thought was that the sounds were coming from the adjacent office suite, since the walls in our building were surprisingly thin. But then, the footsteps seemed to move closer, as if someone was running directly toward my workstation. I was the only person on the entire floor. The security guard was 32 stories below, monitoring the building's entrance. It was impossible for the sounds to be coming from him. I paused the music to listen more carefully. The footsteps continued back and forth, left to right, as if someone was pacing frantically in the open area directly in front of my desk. The pattern was erratic, sometimes quick bursts of movement, sometimes slower, more deliberate steps. I'm not easily frightened, so I simply shrugged it off and turned the music back on. increasing the volume to mask whatever was causing the sounds. I assumed my mind was playing tricks on me, creating audio illusions in the empty space. The footsteps stopped abruptly. I breathed a sigh of relief, convinced that I had been imagining the whole thing. Then I heard 3 distinct voices, laughing behind me. The laughter was clear and unmistakable, not muffled or distant, but as if 3 people were standing just a few feet away from my chair. My skin erupted in goosebumps as I slowly turned around. Behind me was nothing but floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the Seattle skyline. From the 32nd floor, I could see other office buildings, the Space Needle in the distance, and the waters of Puget Sound stretching toward the Olympic Mountains. But there was nowhere for anyone to hide, nowhere for anyone to stand. I turned off the music completely. The laughter continued for several more seconds before fading away. At that point, I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. I saved my work to a flash drive, shut down my computer, gathered my things, and prepared to leave. The company had a strict policy requiring the last person to leave any floor to lock the main entrance door, a security measure to prevent unauthorized access to our client files and equipment. As the only employee in the office that day, I was responsible for securing the space. I double-checked that the door was properly locked, testing the handle to make sure it wouldn't turn. Satisfied that everything was secure, I started walking toward the elevators. Halfway down the corridor, I heard a sharp click behind me. My heart was already racing, and every instinct told me not to look back. But I couldn't help myself. I had to know what had made that sound. The door I had just locked and secured was slowly swinging open. There was no wind in the sealed building, no one else on the floor, and no mechanical reason for the door to open on its own. As I watched in horrified fascination, the door continued its slow arc until it was completely open. Then, without warning, it slammed shut with tremendous force. The sound echoed through the empty corridor like a gunshot. I didn't wait to see what might happen next. I ran to the elevator bank and frantically pressed the call button. When the doors finally opened, I practically dove inside and didn't stop shaking until I reached the safety of the lobby. I never worked alone in that building again. Whatever presence shared that 32nd floor with us during the day made it clear that after hours, the space belonged to someone or something else entirely. My name is Brittany, and I'm going through one of the most terrifying moments of my life. It all started a few days ago when I decided to look for a new job. I live in subsidized housing and was unemployed. So when I saw an ad that promised employment as an assistant, it immediately caught my attention. The ad said I only had to make a call to leave my name and address. So I went for it and dialed the number. "Hello, I'm calling about the assistant position. Is it still available?" I asked with a slight tremor in my voice. On the other side, a deep voice responded, "Yes, can you give me your name and address?" It was a huge mistake, but I gave it to him. The guy assured me I could start immediately and sent me the address of a warehouse. Without thinking much about it, I got on a bus headed to the location, hoping to get the job I desperately needed. When I arrived, the air was thick with a putrid smell of decay and decomposition. Everything around me was chaos. The floor was covered with discarded and broken objects, and there were pieces of boxes everywhere. It clearly wasn't what I expected, and at that moment, I felt a chill run up my spine. I started thinking that maybe I hadn't made the best decision coming to this place. But suddenly, a tall, strange-looking guy approached me. His skin was a weird grayish color with a slight yellowish tint, and his eyes looked like a snake's because of the sharpness of his gaze and the greenish color of his irises. He had thin lips that looked pursed, and his presence was intimidating. "Are you the new assistant?" he said with a voice that left no room for doubt. "Your job here is to move furniture and objects when necessary, and remember, don't open any boxes. That's rule number 1. Despite his brusqueness, I nodded. I certainly didn't like how he looked at me or the authoritarian and hateful tone with which he spoke, but I let it pass. The manager was quick to give me instructions, and soon I found myself trapped in the work. Without realizing it, he had positioned himself right behind me and was watching me while I moved boxes and furniture. With each hour that passed, I felt more and more uncomfortable since the boxes I needed to move were very heavy, to the point where I had to strain a lot just to make progress. The uncomfortable feeling of knowing he was watching me made everything even more difficult because I felt such pressure. However, at one point he left the place and let me do my work on my own. Curiosity has always been my downfall, so of course I couldn't help but wonder what was in those boxes I was organizing and why they were so heavy. It was like a voice in my head was pushing me to open them and look at what was inside. Although I spent the whole time trying to ignore my curiosity, I finally couldn't resist and opened one of them. When I did, some packing peanuts spilled out and a repugnant stench escaped from the box. As I removed the packing material, what I saw made me jump back. It was a hand, a rotting hand protruding from among the peanuts. My stomach immediately turned, and panic invaded me from head to toe. God, what have I gotten myself into? What is all this? I thought. At that instant, I heard the manager's voice behind me. "What are you doing, girl?" His voice was full of fury and made me spin around. His gaze was now more terrifying, and fear took hold of me. I was trapped in a nightmare and didn't know how to escape. "You remember what I told you about opening boxes, right?" "Well, that just became a huge problem, Brittany," the manager told me. He was a guy who seemed like he came out of a horror movie. He looked at me with eyes that sparkled with rage while holding a crowbar in his hand. "You're fired," he shouted, roughly dragging me by the arm. I tried to break free, but he pushed me toward a back room and made me sit in a chair. Then, with a quick movement, he handcuffed my wrists to the armrests without me being able to do anything to prevent it. I immediately started screaming, "Let me go, please." But the guy had no intention of listening. "You're a witness to something you shouldn't have seen, and since you know what I do, I can't let you go free. What I need to do is call someone to take care of you." Those words made me shudder, but before I could say a word, he rushed out of the room like lightning, leaving me trapped and completely alone. Fortunately, luck smiled on me a little, since being quite thin, I managed to slip my wrists out of the handcuffs, and without wasting time, I ran out of the warehouse feeling like my heart was beating 1,000 times per hour. The manager had gone into a small room, and I thought he might be talking on the phone. If he caught me again, there was no way I'd live to tell about it. So I ran as fast as I could with my adrenaline at 1,000, until I finally reached a police station, soaked in sweat and breathless. I told the officers everything that had happened. and luckily they took the situation seriously and sent some of their colleagues to the warehouse. One of the officers offered to take me home, and I accepted, relieved not to be alone. But I quickly noticed something wasn't right. "Where are you going? This isn't the way to my house," I said, realizing he was taking a detour. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw those evil eyes shining in his gaze. And that's when I realized the officer was taking me back to the same place I had just escaped from. Panic invaded me again, and on impulse, I grabbed the door handle, opened it, and jumped out of the car while it was still moving. The fall obviously wasn't pretty, but I managed to get up and ran nonstop until I got home, feeling like every part of me burned with exhaustion. Once inside, I hid in my room, not knowing who to turn to or what to do. I could no longer trust the police, so what else could I do? While I was trying to calm down, suddenly my phone rang. I knew I shouldn't answer unknown numbers, but I did. Then I recognized the voice instantly. "You're not thinking of doing something stupid, are you? I'm coming to your house right now. Don't move a single muscle." I hung up instantly and moved away from the window, turning off all the lights and locking the doors. I cursed myself for having the brilliant idea of giving him my address. At that moment, desperation and fear invaded me more than ever. So I ran out of the house and asked one of my neighbors for help, Mrs. Margaret. I hurriedly told her what had happened to me and asked her to please let me hide on her property. She was a 79-year-old widow, and I was sure no one would suspect I might be there. She was very surprised to hear what I was telling her, and just then I could see a black car park at the entrance to my house. So I begged her to let me in. Luckily, Mrs. Margaret saw the desperation on my face and immediately opened the door for me to come in and offered me a place in her basement. It's been 7 days since that happened, and I'm still hidden in Mrs. Margaret's basement, and I have no idea what I'm going to do now. The old woman has been incredibly kind, bringing me food and checking on me regularly. She's even let me use her old computer to try to research what I witnessed. What I found made my blood run cold. Searching through local news archives, I discovered reports about missing persons in the area, all young women who had responded to similar job advertisements. The pattern was always the same: promises of easy work, immediate employment, and then nothing. They simply vanished. I realized I had stumbled into something much bigger and more horrifying than I initially thought. This wasn't just one sick individual. This was an organized operation. The fake police officer proved that this network had connections. People on the inside who could make evidence disappear and witnesses vanish. Mrs. Margaret and I have been discussing what to do. She suggested contacting the FBI, since the local police clearly can't be trusted. But I'm terrified that even federal agents might not be safe from corruption. How do you know who to trust when the very people sworn to protect you might be part of the nightmare? Every night I hear cars driving slowly past Mrs. Margaret's house. Sometimes they stop for a few minutes before moving on. I know they're looking for me. I can feel their eyes searching every shadow, every potential hiding place. The worst part is the waiting. I know this can't last forever. Eventually, I'll have to make a move, take a risk, try to get real help. But for now, I'm trapped in this basement, living in a waking nightmare, knowing that somewhere out there, other girls might be responding to those same advertisements, walking into the same trap I barely escaped. Mrs. Margaret keeps telling me we'll find a way out of this, but I can see the fear in her eyes too. She knows she's risking her life to help me. Sometimes I wonder if I should just disappear, try to start over somewhere far away. But I also know that if I don't find a way to expose this operation, other girls will suffer the same fate as those poor souls in those boxes. The question that haunts me most is, how many more warehouses are there? How many more boxes? And how many more girls like me are out there right now, desperately looking for work, with no idea they're about to walk into hell? My name is Martha. I'm 38 years old, and I've never been one to believe in hauntings. I work at the district health center, raise my almost teenage son, and live life as it comes. I don't keep diaries or social media accounts because I lack the time and patience. But after what happened in the early hours of November 2nd, I had to put everything in writing. I'm saying this before anyone claims my memory will betray me, or that fear exaggerated what I saw. Whoever reads this isn't obligated to believe it, but maybe they'll understand why I still leave a lamp burning in the kitchen all night long. I grew up hearing my grandmother repeat that All Souls Day isn't just for visiting graves. It's when souls feel homesick for the living and return to check if they're still remembered. The old woman would decorate the house with basil sprigs, light a white candle on top of the stove, and murmur Hail Marys until she dozed off. Back then, I thought it was all countryside folklore. Now I'm not so sure. On the eve of this All Souls Day, the night of November 1st, almost summer but with cold wind, my son Nicholas, 14 years old, woke up feverish with an inflamed throat. My husband Thales lives with constant lower back pain from cement he carried in his youth and had already gone to bed before 10 o'clock. I'd spent the entire day taking care of medicine for the boy and warm soup for my husband. Even exhausted, I felt the urge to pray for our dead. The main church was under renovation, so the priest had transferred the vigil to the old cemetery up on the hill where my mother rests. It's just over half a mile away, but the street has no street lights for half the route. "You're going alone?" Thales asked. "I'll go and come back quickly. I need to light a candle for Mom." Nicholas was sleeping and wouldn't even notice. "Then take this new flashlight, the one I bought at the market. The old one fails at the wrong time." I put on a brown wool coat down to my knees, tied a blue scarf on my head, and rubbed alcohol on my hands, a habit left over from the pandemic. Before leaving, I checked that Nicholas was breathing well and left the door ajar so the hallway light would reach his room in case he woke up. I went down the dirt road, smelling the scent of cut grass coming from the yards. The town square clock read 11:20. The cemetery seemed like another world. Among small headstones, farm workers lined up candles. The trembling flames projected tired faces on worn stones. The priest had improvised a wooden altar in front of the crucifix. I stayed at a certain distance, but could still hear everything. He spoke about longing turning into prayer, and about not letting the fear of darkness swallow our gratitude. At the final blessing, he passed a bottle of holy water from hand to hand. I wet my fingers and made the sign of the cross on my forehead, feeling a slight burning sensation. I thought it was my imagination. When the service ended, I began descending at 11:50. The fog already covered the valley like dirty cotton. Each breath came back cold, and the new flashlight seemed incapable of clearing a path. As I moved away, the voices behind me faded, leaving only branch snaps and cricket fragments. I remembered how my mother hated seeing me alone after 11 o'clock. I even smiled thinking about how she would scold me. It was near the second ravine that I heard the creaking of wheels. I thought of some old car, but it was a lighter, repetitive sound accompanied by dry beats, hooves. I turned the flashlight backward, nothing but my own beam cutting through fog. The noise stopped. I continued 20 steps ahead. The creaking resumed, now closer. I stopped again, nothing. I turned off the light to see if my eyes would adjust. When my pupils dilated, I saw a dark silhouette. A low carriage painted matte black, thin wheels that sparked when they touched stone. Pulling the carriage was a pair of mules of the same color. They looked like they'd stepped out of an old photograph, wood and leather, without shine. On the upright seat was the driver, covered by a long cape, wide-brimmed hat hiding his face. The entire ensemble advanced as if floating. The hooves touched the ground but didn't raise dust. He stopped 1/2 meter from me. "Good evening. Climb up. I'll take you home. This hour isn't suitable for walking alone." I politely refused, pointing out that I lived nearby, a blatant lie. Half the road still remained. He didn't move, didn't question. I took a deep breath to go around him. As I passed, the moonlight reflected on the reins' fine leather. But instead of knots, there was something that moved, resembling pulsing veins. I moved 2 meters away. The carriage rolled alongside me without the sound of steps. The mules kept their necks rigid, eyes fixed ahead like pushed statues. The driver spoke again. "Whoever prays for the dead attracts company. Today there are souls that don't want to return alone." "My prayers are just fond memories," I replied. "Not every memory is good. Not every soul is gentle." Until then, I was fighting against nervous laughter. When I raised the flashlight, wanting to see his face to convince myself it was just someone in costume, the hat cast too much shadow. I only saw the outline of a chin without a beard. More frightening than ugly is seeing nothing at all. I tried to quicken my pace. The carriage pulled at the same speed. One of the mules turned its snout in my direction. I smelled an unusual scent, a mixture of melted candle and aged iron. The animal opened its mouth. It didn't neigh. The voice that came out was hoarse, metallic, from the bottom of a well. "Climb." The single word sounded deep inside my ears, more felt than heard. I backed away, almost stumbling. The driver didn't react as if it were normal for an animal to speak. "I'm not interested, thank you," I said. "It will get worse," said the man without moving his lips. "The path will want you." He gave a light crack of the reins. The carriage slid forward, cutting across my path, forcing me to stop. On the sides, I noticed rusted metal plates with numbers engraved, blurred by time. The wheels turned slowly and creaked like an old gate. The whole thing seemed to be waiting, only for my decision. I headed for the ravine. The part covered by damp grass was the most dangerous option, but the only one without the carriage. I slipped, dirtied my coat. The carriage accompanied me close to the edge, hooves centimeters from my shoulder. The left mule turned its head, and I noticed it had no eyes, just dark cavities releasing vapor. The voice came strong like contained thunder. "Climb." I ran diagonally, escaping to the old loggers' trail that connected to a parallel stretch of road. Vegetation swallowed the path, but I remembered the route. Branches hit my face, feet sank in mud, heart beat at my neck. The sound of the carriage, which before seemed metallic, was now muffled, but I knew it continued behind me. At the end of the trail was a narrow wooden bridge over a shallow stream. I reached the bridge and heard creaking behind me, louder than before. I pointed the flashlight. The carriage was coming close, but seemed not to touch the ground. Wheels passed 2 fingers from the stones, without disturbing the water. The driver raised his face for a split second. The moon escaped from a cloud and illuminated his skin, smooth without pores, candle-colored. No eyebrows, no eyelashes. The eyes were flattened, gray without shine. The grimace looked like a wax doll. I pressed my body against the rotten railing, wanting passage. The driver pointed to the right as if offering a seat. The voice of both mules came simultaneously, syncopated, impossible to reproduce without shuddering. Climb, climb, climb. I threw the flashlight at them, but it was like throwing it into a well. It went out before touching the carriage floor, swallowed by thick darkness. I turned my back and ran without looking. I crossed the entire bridge, jumped a ditch, fell onto the main road. My knees throbbed, but I kept going. The fog hid everything, and I hoped it would hide me too. Then total silence. No cricket, no frog, even the wind stopped. Instinct told me not to turn around, but I did. About 50 feet away, there was the carriage, stopped like a display in a closed shop. The lantern hanging from the front lit up by itself, illuminating each pulsing rein. The driver raised both arms, and the mules lifted their front legs, but not like animals. They looked like dolls pulled by invisible strings. Through the space between their bodies flowed something that gleamed, not water, not blood, something black, sticky, too dark. I stopped breathing. A thud behind me broke the trance, a door opening. It was Mrs. Teresa, the faith healer who lives in the first house after the bridge. She held an old kerosene lamp and called, "Girl, what are you doing wandering in this cold?" When she spoke, I looked again at the road. The carriage had vanished, not even wheel marks. The thick air dissolved into common fog as if nothing had happened. I felt my legs go weak. Teresa grabbed me before I collapsed and took me to the porch. There, her husband, Mr. Amadeus, sat me in a straw chair and brought a blanket. I trembled so much I bit my teeth until they hurt. It took me a while to explain. They listened without interrupting, eyes wide, but without signs of mockery. Teresa, who learned healing prayers from her midwife mother, prepared lemon balm tea and put a sprig of rue behind my ear. Then she took the bottle of water blessed on Easter Saturday, wet her fingers, and touched my neck. I felt a strong burning sensation. She moved my hair aside. There was a reddish mark on the skin resembling a crooked cross, poorly defined outline like a light burn. It wasn't bleeding but throbbing. Before dawn, Mr. Amadeus escorted me home. Thales opened the door, crumpled with worry. Me, covered in mud, holding someone else's blanket, looked like I'd come out of a nightmare. I told everything again, trying to sound coherent. He didn't believe the part about the mule speaking, but the mark on my neck had an iron smell impossible to deny. Nicholas woke up coughing and took a while to notice my condition. When he saw dried blood on my arm, he hugged me, frightened. In the following mornings, Thales looked for wheel marks on the road. He found 2 grooves in the wet gravel, but they ended in the middle of nowhere, no beginning or end. He showed the neighbor, who shrugged, saying some market carriage could have backed up. Still, he spread burned coarse salt at the gate, an idea he copied from the internet. Days passed. Nicholas got better. I returned to the health center, but no one cleaned away that chill that wakes me punctually at 2 o'clock in the morning. When the clock in the living room strikes 2 chimes, I write it out in full to avoid facing numbers. I smell kerosene and iron, and the floor creaks like old wood. I get up, go to the kitchen, pray what I know. At first, Thales complained. Now he does the same thing. I went to church when it reopened. The priest advised prayer, brief fasting, maybe a promise. I didn't tell him everything, afraid of becoming a laughingstock. But I mentioned I'd heard a strange animal voice. The priest made the sign of the cross, citing stories of lost souls hitching rides in death carriages. According to him, sometimes the dead present themselves disguised as friendly hitchhikers. Other times, death itself dresses as a coachman offering a shortcut. I left there with a thread of ice running down my spine. Close to Christmas, I woke at dawn to a dry noise, the same rhythm of wheels and hooves. I reached the window and saw a lamp lit in the neighbor's yard. The family that lived there was spending the holidays at the beach. The house should be empty. I sharpened my vision. The lamp swayed as if hanging from a hook. Inaudible whispers came from the darkness. I locked the windows, turned on the radio quietly, sat on the floor until the first rooster. In the morning, there were mule tracks and wheel marks in the yard forming a half-moon, as if the carriage had made a U-turn right where the lemon tree stands. I don't tell Thales everything anymore because he deserves rest. I went back to talk to Mrs. Teresa. She tells me to drink a sip of holy water before sleeping and hang rue branches on the door. I do it, but I still wake up. When I close my eyes, I see the driver raising his arms, see the faceless mules whispering that short, non-negotiable command. I never return to the cemetery at night. I pray at home without candles, only in thought, asking that my memory doesn't make anyone appear. I write this sitting at the kitchen table, lamp lit beside me. The rest of the house sleeps. The clock shows 1:59. 1 minute left until that hour. I'm going to pray before the sound approaches again. And if you read this, recognize the warning. When you hear wheels in the mist and a voice that shouldn't have a body, don't argue, don't challenge. Turn back while there's time. Otherwise, the invitation might be extended to you too. My name is Marcus, and I'm 44 years old. Life has thrown me some curveballs, but you get up, dust yourself off, and keep moving forward. That's what they say anyway. The problem is that some dust doesn't come off. There's dirt that sticks to your soul that you carry forever. What I'm about to tell you happened about 3 years ago here in Phoenix. But to this day, when the silence of the night becomes too heavy, I hear it. And I know it's not just in my head. At least, I pray it's not. I'm not from here. I came from a small town in rural Arizona, one of those places where everyone knows everyone. I came to the city out of necessity, the worst kind of all, my daughter's health. My daughter Emma, 8 years old at the time, almost didn't make it. An infection that doctors couldn't identify, eating away at her body from the inside. There were months of hospitals, ICU, sleepless nights in a plastic chair outside her room, listening to the beeping of machines, and asking God not to let that sound stop. My wife Linda stayed there like a rock. She didn't leave our little girl's side for a minute. And I came here to the big city to fight, to get the money we didn't have to pay for medications that insurance wouldn't cover, to ensure Emma had a chance. Thank God she survived. Today she's a healthy 11-year-old girl who runs, fights with her younger brother, goes to school. Her voice on the phone is the most beautiful music in the world to me. But that time left a debt in me, not a money debt, but a debt of presence. Every penny I earn, I send to them. Everything I do, every risk I take is thinking of them. And that's why I got into this delivery business. It's not app food delivery, it's a more informal service, no receipts, no records, no questions. I work for myself. I have a Ford Transit, a white Warrior van that's seen more dark corners of this city than most cops. Most clients prefer to receive at night. The less people see the movement, the better. Sometimes it's a small package, sometimes big boxes. They say it's clothes from Mexico, cell phone parts, electronics. I don't ask. My job is to pick up at point A and drop off at point B. What's inside isn't my business. At first, I did everything alone, but fear was a constant companion. Not fear of being robbed, you learn to handle that. It's a different fear, fear of silence, of loneliness, fear of something happening in a dead-end alley at 2 in the morning, and no one ever finding me again. That's when I met Antonio. He's from the same area, came here around the same time I did. We shared a studio apartment for a few months until I could get settled. Antonio is younger, more fearful, more superstitious, I'd say, but he's good people, hardworking. We started doing deliveries together. One would drive, the other would keep watch. We'd split the profit and the fear. It got easier. Our meeting point was often a 24-hour diner that sold tamales and menudo. The smell of the food reminded me of home, of family celebrations. We'd sit there in the middle of the night with the smell of corn and cheese in the air and plan our route. So Marcus, what's the deal tonight? He'd always ask with that rural accent that neither he nor I had lost. Got a delivery out by the airport and another at a downtown building. The downtown one pays better, I'd respond, looking at the map on my phone. I live in a rented studio apartment, one room that serves as bedroom, living room, and kitchen. It's small, but it's what I can afford. The walls are thin. I hear my neighbors' lives, the TV, a child crying, but most of the time what I hear is silence, loneliness. Coming home after a night of work with my body aching and my head spinning, and having no one to say goodnight to is hard. My only luxury is the internet. It's through it that I see my family. I video call every day. I see Emma showing me her homework, my boy showing me a drawing. Linda smiling a tired smile, but a smile. I hang up the phone and the house is empty again. The silence returns heavy. That's when you think foolish thoughts, wonder if it's worth it. But then I look at their photo, Emma smiling with her gap-toothed grin, and I know it's worth it. Every second is worth it. The problem is that in our line of work, you deal with all kinds of people, and you end up seeing things you'd rather not see. And sometimes those things come home with you. It all started on a hot October night. The air was dry, the sky reddened by dust that gave no respite. We were at the diner, me drinking black coffee, Antonio gnawing on a tamale. I had received a message for a new delivery at a middle-class apartment building, a place we didn't usually go to. The payment was good, well above average. Hey, Antonio, this one's good. Pays well, we'll split it, I said, showing him my phone. He looked at the address and frowned. Marcus, I'm not going to that building. Why, you know the area. Is it dangerous? No, the area's fine. The problem is the client. I made a delivery to her once, never again. Why, doesn't she pay right? Is she difficult? Antonio stopped chewing, looked around as if afraid someone might hear. He leaned over the table. No, Marcus, she pays on time. The problem is the woman is weird. There's a curse on her, a heavy energy. I went there once. Left with my head buzzing, a clicking inside my ear that wouldn't stop. I was paranoid all night. Forget it, Marcus. That money isn't worth the bad luck. I laughed. Stop being a coward, Antonio. It must be in your head. A clicking. What's that? The woman has a tic. That's all. I need this money. Emma's physical therapy went up. You know best, he said seriously. But I'm not going. If you want to go, go alone. But if I were you, I wouldn't. There are things it's better not to mess with. I ignored him. I thought it was just superstitious nonsense. I arranged the delivery with the woman by text, 11 at night. She responded immediately. Okay, apartment 302. Intercom broken. Come straight up. At 10:30, I left in my transit. The city was calm. The heat had decreased a bit. I turned on the radio. Some country duo was singing a heartbreak song. I felt good, confident. Antonio was just a scaredy cat, that's all. The building was exactly as described. A block of about 10 floors, paint a bit faded, on a quiet, tree-lined street. I parked in front, got the box from the van. It was light, seemed to contain shoes or something similar, and went in. The front gate was ajar. The entrance hall was silent, smelled of wax and old things. The elevator was old, one of those with accordion gates. I pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The ride was slow, with the elevator creaking. The 3rd floor hallway was long, with a faded red carpet that muffled the sound of my steps. I stopped in front of door 302. There was no doorbell, just a peephole. I knocked lightly. I waited 1, 2, 3 seconds. I heard the sound of a lock being turned. The door opened, but just a crack. A woman appeared. She must have been about 35, 40 years old. Straight black hair falling over her shoulders, pale face without makeup. She wore a simple white t-shirt and gray sweatpants. She looked normal, tired maybe. Good evening, the delivery, I said, holding the box. Oh yes, come in. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. She opened the door wider, and I entered. The apartment was dark. The only light came from a lamp in a corner of the living room that projected long, misshapen shadows on the walls. The furniture was sparse and covered with white sheets, as if the house were moving or abandoned. The air was still heavy. You can put it there on the floor, she said, pointing to an empty space. I put the box on the floor and straightened up. That's when I heard it for the first time. Click, a dry, sharp sound. I thought it was some wooden furniture settling with the temperature change. The amount is what we agreed on, I said, trying to maintain normalcy. Yes, of course. She turned and went to a dresser also covered by a sheet. As she walked, I heard it again, click, click. The sound came from her. I watched more carefully. With each step, each movement, she made a clicking sound with her tongue against the roof of her mouth. It was a loud, precise sound. It wasn't just any nervous tick. It was methodical, rhythmic. She took an envelope from on top of the dresser and turned to me. Now, under the weak light of the lamp, I could see her face better. The paleness was almost sickly, and her eyes, one looked at me steadily, but the other had a slight deviation. It looked at some point over my shoulder. That gave me chills. Here you go. She handed me the envelope. While I took the money to count, the sound increased in frequency. Click, 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 click. It was fast, incessant. And worse, I wasn't just hearing the sound coming from her. It was as if the clicking was inside my own ear, as if her mouth were glued to my eardrum. An invasive, uncomfortable sensation. I counted the money hurriedly, without even checking properly. It was all there. Everything's correct. Thank you. Have a good night, I said, already turning toward the door. You too, she whispered, and the clicking continued. Click, 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 filling the apartment's silence. I got out of there as fast as I could without looking back. In the hallway, the sound disappeared. The relief was immediate. I went down the stairs, jumping the steps 2 at a time. Inside the transit, I locked the doors, took a deep breath. Calm down, Marcus. It's just a weird woman. Antonio got you worked up for nothing. I started the car and left, but in the car's silence while I drove, I heard it again. Click, a single sound inside the car. I looked around, there was nobody. It was my head, it had to be suggestion fatigue. I turned up the radio volume and went home, trying to forget. In the days that followed, life returned to normal. I made other deliveries and tried not to think about that sound anymore, but the memory of that dark apartment wouldn't leave my head. About 2 weeks later, hell really began. I had had a busy night. We went to the outskirts of the city on red dirt roads. I've replayed this story in my head countless times, making sure I don't leave out any details. After turning it over in my mind repeatedly, I realized that before I tell you what happened to me that night in the office, I need to tell you about Mrs. Alina Whitman. On September 15th, 2006, I started working as an IT specialist for the State Department of Transportation in Sacramento. The building was an imposing concrete structure from the 1970s, filled with cramped offices and outdated computer systems. I met Mrs. Whitman on my first day. My supervisor introduced her as the department's inventory coordinator, the only person who truly understood the antiquated database system that tracked everything from office supplies to heavy machinery. She had worked there for over 30 years, and her knowledge was considered irreplaceable. Mrs. Whitman was an elegant woman in her late 60s, always impeccably dressed in pressed blouses and wool skirts that seemed to belong to an earlier era. But what I remember most about her were her hands. They were extraordinarily soft and warm, with skin so smooth it felt like it had been molded from the finest wax. Whenever she shook hands, which she did with everyone, every morning, the sensation lingered on your palm for minutes afterward. She was the model employee. Never late, never absent, never complaining. While others took extended lunch breaks or left early on Fridays, Mrs. Whitman remained at her desk, methodically entering data into the ancient inventory system with the precision of a master craftsman. The system itself was a nightmare, a DOS-based program from the early 90s with a user interface that looked like something from the dawn of computing. It was prone to crashes, had no intuitive navigation, and required a series of complex key combinations to perform even basic functions. But Mrs. Whitman navigated it flawlessly, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced ease. 6 months before her scheduled retirement, I was assigned to document her knowledge of the system. Someone would need to take over her responsibilities, and the department couldn't afford to lose decades of accumulated expertise. Several evenings a week, after Mrs. Whitman finished her regular duties, I would sit at her desk and explore the system while she guided me through its intricacies. Each time she left for the day, she would shake my hand in farewell, that firm, warm grip that felt so distinctly like touching wax. She kept her keyboard and mouse locked in her desk drawer each night. Theft was common in the building, and valuable items had a way of disappearing if left unsecured. She had given me a spare key so I could access her workstation after hours. By mid-October, I had mastered about 85% of the system's functions. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, Mrs. Whitman called my extension. Her voice carried its usual calm professionalism, as she explained that her computer was experiencing some kind of problem. Normally, she was extraordinarily detailed when reporting technical issues. She would describe error messages word for word, explain exactly which keys she had pressed, and provide a complete timeline of events. But this time, she simply said the computer had something wrong with it. It was nearly 6 o'clock, but the building was still busy with employees finishing their daily tasks. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor, where the inventory department was located. The hallway hummed with the usual end-of-day activity. Mrs. Whitman's office door was open, but I didn't see her at her desk. I stepped inside and looked around, thinking she might be at the filing cabinets or the copy machine. "Can I help you with something?" a voice said behind me. I turned to find a young woman in her 20s, already wearing her coat and carrying her purse, clearly ready to leave for the day. I told her I was looking for Mrs. Whitman. The woman's expression grew puzzled. She asked me to repeat the name, as if she hadn't heard me correctly. When I said it again and pointed toward Mrs. Whitman's desk, the woman set down her purse and walked closer to me. Her hands, I noticed, were also soft to the touch when she placed one on my arm. But they were cold, nothing like the warm, waxy texture of Mrs. Whitman's hands. She looked directly into my eyes and said, very quietly, that the person I was looking for had passed away the previous week. "That's impossible," I replied immediately. "She called me less than an hour ago. I'm certain it was her voice." The young woman cleared her throat. Her voice trembled slightly as she pointed toward the office entrance, where a black ribbon had been hung above the doorframe. The sight of it hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my stomach drop. I didn't know what to say. I mumbled an apology and started toward the door, but the woman called me back. She explained that they had been meaning to contact me because I was the only person with access to Mrs. Whitman's desk. They needed someone to retrieve important documents, system manuals, password lists, procedural notes, everything that would be necessary for her replacement to learn the job. She asked if I could gather these materials and leave them on the supervisor's desk. I walked over to Mrs. Whitman's workstation and pulled the keys from my pants pocket. As I did, the young woman's cell phone rang. The sudden sound made me jump. She stepped outside to take the call, leaving me alone in the office. I inserted the key into the desk drawer and turned it. The lock opened smoothly, just as it always had. I reached inside the narrow space to retrieve the keyboard and mouse. Something grasped my hand. It was unmistakably a human hand, soft, warm, and with that distinctive waxy texture I knew so well. There was no doubt in my mind whose hand it was. I didn't pull away immediately. Despite my fear, the contact was oddly comforting, familiar. After a few seconds, I gently withdrew my hand and began removing items from the drawer. I found the keyboard, mouse, several thick binders, and numerous sheets of handwritten notes covered in Mrs. Whitman's precise handwriting. I carried everything to the supervisor's desk and arranged it neatly. When I returned to close the drawer, I looked inside one more time. It was completely empty, nothing but bare wood. As I placed the keyboard in front of her monitor, I noticed a small yellow sticky note attached to the space bar. Written in black ink, in Mrs. Whitman's unmistakable script, was a single word: "Thank you." I left the building that night with more questions than answers. But I knew one thing for certain: Mrs. Whitman's dedication to her work hadn't ended with her death. I've never been one to write down anything. Those who know me understand that I prefer the sound of a hoe hitting earth to the noise of typing keys. But for some days now, my daughter has been asking me again why her brother's name became a forbidden word in this house. After so much time swallowing the subject, I decided to open this wound and tell what happened in my own way, to see if my soul can find peace, mine, and maybe his. My name is Rosa. When everything happened, I was 34 years old and lived with my husband Antonio on a small farm squeezed between a cotton field and a disused pond. The pond had been dug decades before to irrigate cotton, just a few steps from our backyard. A deep hole covered by old boards that we called the well. At that time, our oldest son Theodore was 8 years old, and our youngest, Lydia, was barely past 3. We lived off cotton picking and some laying hens. Nothing was lacking, but work was plenty. Our routine was simple. Before sunrise, Antonio would leave for the cotton field. I'd tend the chickens, give the children breakfast, and while they played with wooden cars and rusty little pots, I'd wash clothes at the wash basin. In the late afternoon, when the sky turned the color of fire, we'd gather everyone in the yard, tell stories, roast corn on the coals. That's how I thought life would be forever. It was on a Monday in the second week of June. I say it like that because I don't keep track of calendars, that everything went wrong. Winter was approaching, but the air was muggy, loaded with that sweet smell of cut cotton that permeates your clothes. I had just finished hanging the last pieces on the line and turned my attention to the beans boiling when I noticed Theodore was no longer in the yard. Lydia was playing alone, dragging a one-armed doll. "Where's your brother?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron. "Went looking for frogs in the water hole," she answered without lifting her eyes. My heart raced. Theodore was always fascinated by the well. I swore I had locked the cover with chains, but curious boys have the gift of finding gaps. I ran out, kicking pebbles. When I got close, I smelled damp earth mixed with something sour. The boards had been pushed apart, forming a dark opening. I called his name. No response, just the echo of my panic. I knelt and shouted again. That's when I heard a muffled splash from below. My voice trembled, but I asked, "Teddy, can you hear me?" Nothing. The hole swallowed every sound. I ran back, grabbed an old flashlight, and descended the improvised wooden ladder stuck in the dirt wall of the well. My feet slipped in the mud. The flashlight illuminated yellow circles. About 10 feet down, there was a layer of dark, moving water. I saw Theodore's cap floating, and a little farther, his small body face down. I don't remember exactly how I reached my son. I only recall pulling the body, feeling the wet weight and the cold that went through my arms. I tried to breathe into his mouth, pressed his chest like I'd seen in health clinic pamphlets, but the boy didn't react. My screams echoed in the well like trapped bellowing. When I lifted my face, the outline of the opening above seemed distant, crooked, as if everything was spinning. I carried Theodore step by step, felt my knees fail, but I didn't let go. In the yard, I laid my son on the packed earth, screaming for Antonio. He arrived breathless, dirty with cotton fiber, and saw the scene. His eyes got lost in the pallor. We both tried everything, but it was too late. Theodore rested with his mouth half open, as if he still wanted to finish an interrupted sentence. We buried the boy in the back of the farm, next to a lemon tree he used to like climbing to pick green fruit. We held a simple wake with tallow candles and litanies sung by Mrs. Arlette, the community's faith healer. The parish priest had fallen ill. There was no mass. The neighborhood stayed around, bringing little pies and timid tears. Antonio didn't cry in front of anyone. Only I saw his shoulder tremble at dawn. After that, the house entered a silence that buzzed. Lydia stopped humming her little songs. Antonio began staying longer in the cotton field, returning only late at night, exhausted, dirty, silent. I blamed myself with every step. If I had watched better, if I hadn't trusted that the cover was secure. They say grief is like moisture. If you don't air out the wall, it creates mold. Here, sadness impregnated everything, even the smell of coffee. I'd wake before the rooster, but stay in my nightgown, staring at the empty water glass on the table. No hunger, no strength, just a constant tightness that throbbed. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday, I woke with Lydia poking me. It was still dark, but moonlight entered through the window. "Mama, Teddy is asking for bread," she whispered. I sat on the bed, confused. I tried to smile, to say that her brother was with the angels, but before I could respond, Lydia completed. "He's by the stove. Said you forgot to warm it up." A chill slid over the top of my head, but it wasn't one of those expressions from books. It was a hot wave that left me dizzy. I took Lydia in my arms and went to the kitchen. There were only shadows. The wood stove was cold, the pots empty. I lit the oil lamp, nothing but silence. Lydia twisted the hem of my nightgown, puzzled. In the following days, strange episodes multiplied. I heard whispers coming from the yard, always at dusk. Lydia said she talked with her brother. One afternoon, I found her on the living room floor drawing with charcoal. In the scribbles, there were 2 stick figures. One with spiky hair like Theodore's, another faceless. I asked who it was. "It's the water lady who comes to play when Teddy calls," she explained, as if talking about the most common of neighbors. The mischievous expression in Lydia's eyes mixed with something empty, as if she were telling a dream she didn't want to wake up from. I stored the drawing in the drawer and suppressed the urge to tear it up. On the night of St. John, when the sky usually filled with balloons, it stayed overcast. Antonio stretched his chat with the neighbors and came home late, stumbling with fatigue. We were preparing for bed when he asked if I had washed Lydia's dress. I said yes. "Then why are there wet clothes dripping on the line?" he asked, frowning. We went outside. Among the stretched sheets hung a small white dress, soaked. Drops fell onto the dry earth. I didn't recognize that piece. I approached, touched the fabric. It smelled of stagnant water. A frog croaked nearby, as if mocking. I tied the dress in a plastic bag bundle and threw it in the metal drum we used to burn trash. The next morning, I found Lydia in the yard next to the same dress, now dry, spread over a stone as if someone had put it there to bleach. She was trying to put it on over her clothes. My head throbbed. I took the dress away hurriedly, put the girl in other clothes. The dress disappeared again. I told everything to Mrs. Arlette. She frowned and told an old tale about water spirits, beings that roam stagnant water gaps, attracted by a mother's weeping. According to her, when a child passes away suddenly, the crying of the living opens a path for these beings. First, they imitate the deceased to gain trust. Then they demand company. Frightened, I asked for help. Mrs. Arlette came over with rue, sprinkled holy water, and taught a prayer I should say before closing my eyes. She also ordered us to burn something dear to the dead to free the trapped memory. Antonio didn't like the idea, but we ended up agreeing to surrender Theodore's favorite slingshot, a handmade one of twisted branch and tire leather. On the chosen afternoon, the sun was still high, but the wind tasted of rust. We went to the barn where we stored the dry straw. Antonio lit an improvised bonfire and left the slingshot in the center of the flame. While the embers rose, a stench of burned rubber spread. I heard a loud crack. It sounded like a whip in the air, and the flame almost went out, as if sucked away. Then something blew behind me. I turned quickly and saw a figure in the barn door, tall, with arms too long, seeming to wrap itself in dark fabric that dripped like water. In place of a face, a wet hole reflected the bonfire's light. A low lament came from it, mixing a child's voice with wind whistle. My knees failed. Antonio pulled my arm. "Rosa, don't look," he shouted, but my eyes were already trapped in the scene. The figure bent as if searching for something on the ground. That's when I noticed Lydia nearby, her little hand extended, offering it a rag doll. I ran, grabbed my daughter, felt my heart almost tear my ribs. The figure backed 2 steps and disappeared, dripping down the wall as if the shadow itself had life. We ran to the yard. The bonfire went out by itself. Only a circle of ashes remained. The slingshot had turned into a deformed coal, and inside it, I found 2 cracked lemon seeds. The same ones the boy kept in his pocket to plant near the tree that stood over his grave. After that night, I sealed the well door with concrete slabs, threw coarse salt around it, and made Lydia always sleep in the same room as me. She cried without understanding why her brother couldn't come in. I said Theodore now lived in another place, that he came only to visit in dreams. The following days were hard. Outside, everything seemed normal: cotton cut, rooster crowing, pain pills on the shelf. Inside me, a constant waiting. I prayed whispered litanies, lit candles every Friday, avoided looking at the pond. Antonio insisted on maintaining the routine, but I saw the cautious brightness in his eyes, like someone walking on ground that might give way. We thought about selling the farm, but land, even small, holds you by invisible roots. Who would buy a place with a crossed history? So we stayed there, living with a fear no one saw. A month later, it dawned with the smell of rain, but the ground stayed dry. Lydia woke with fever. I spent the day putting wet cloths on her forehead. At nightfall, the sky opened in a leaden tone, and I noticed a wisp of mist hovering over the yard. Long lightning cut through the cotton field, but without thunder. With each flash, the pond seemed to shine. When night advanced, Lydia was delirious, calling her brother. Antonio decided to get the faith healer, but she lived far away, and he feared the weather would turn. I asked him to try anyway. It was me and Lydia. The oil lamp cast shadows on the walls, but I forced myself not to think about those shapes. I murmured Mrs. Arlette's prayer, changing warm cloths. In the early hours there were raindrops, first spaced, then thick. It began dripping through a broken tile. Suddenly, Lydia sat up with a start, eyes wide, mouth open, pointing to the bedroom door. "He came," she whispered with a hoarse voice. My whole body turned to crumbs. I turned slowly. There in the doorway was the same figure from the barn, but now with more defined contours, long arms, female body, viscous dress, and in the center of the face, 2 luminous blue points spinning slowly. She held what remained of the charred slingshot. I was petrified. Lydia got down from the bed and took 2 steps toward the figure, as if attracted by music only she heard. I screamed, but my voice came out weak. Then, in a blind impulse, I grabbed the oil lamp and raised it. The glass burned my hand, but I didn't let go. In a sharp gesture, I hurled the lamp at the apparition. A flash spread. Fire licked the wooden headboard. The figure recoiled, seemed to dissolve into smoke, but before that, I heard a hiss that mixed a child's cry with the rumble of water spinning down a drain. The flames gained strength, and I ran to get Lydia. We escaped to the corridor. I beat the bedroom door and called for Antonio with no response. I ran outside. The rain was getting heavier. Water fell heavy, dragging the smoke smell to the yard. I put Lydia under the porch and ran back with the metal bucket, but the flames already licked the roof. I could only wait. Minutes later, Antonio appeared at the gate, soaked, holding a water jug and a roll of vine with rue. The faith healer couldn't come. He shouted my name, seeing the fire. We ran together along the side, breaking tiles, throwing water, but the room turned to embers in a crack. The rest of the house resisted, only scorched because the rain intensified, punishing each stubborn flame. When the fire yielded and dawn cleared, we turned over the still warm darkness of the room. Among the ashes where the fire had been strongest, I found something that shouldn't be there, a piece of the dress, dried by the heat, as if the apparition itself had left it behind as a final warning. In the center of it, 2 blue buttons, identical to the points I saw on the apparition's face. I gathered courage, picked up the fabric with a shovel, and took it to the well. I threw it inside, hearing the hollow sound of something falling into a bottomless pit. After that, I sealed the cover with cement. Some months passed. Lydia recovered her joy. Sometimes she woke saying she dreamed of her brother, but she added that he was in a bright place, playing with other children. Antonio and I went back to planting. We mended the roof and had a new barn built, far from the pond. I, however, never again approached that cement-covered hole. Today, more than a decade has passed. Lydia is a teenager and doesn't keep memory of what happened. She only says, when she sees me thoughtful, that she dreams of her brother wearing a straw hat and 1 blue eye, and 1 brown eye, sky and earth together. She doesn't know, but Theodore never had eyes of different colors. What she sees is mixture, part memory, part something that doesn't belong to this side. I continue here, writing this story in a school notebook by the light of a weak lamp. I do this because somehow registering the words helps me see boundaries between what is memory and what is haunting. If there's peace for those who lose a child, maybe it's born from recognizing that love remains. But sometimes something else also remains, circling, wanting space. And I need to watch, not to expel completely, but to remember that certain doors, once opened, never close entirely. So if you cross by this farm and hear persistent croaking near the cracked cement, follow your path. No matter how much longing weighs on your chest, don't answer the voice that calls my boy's name. I learned that there are laments that belong only to stagnant water, and it's not up to any of us to return them to the surface. This is a pretty spine-chilling story that happened to me in the early 90s. Back then, I had just graduated from high school and had gotten my first full-time job. College didn't appeal to me at all, so my only option was to throw myself into the working world and stop being a kid to become a productive adult. My job was as a night receptionist at an old hotel in my town called the Riverside Inn. If you have no idea what a night receptionist does, it's basically a mix of things like attending to clients, organizing calls for the next morning, and balancing the night's accounts. Although I was only 18 at the time and had the typical attitude of a lazy teenager, the truth is I quite liked this job. Maybe because it was my first, and you're enthusiastic. Well, the truth was that I liked it most of the time, until strange things started happening, like what I'm going to tell you about, which made me go from thinking it was a great job to thinking it was more like the most terrifying job in the world. It all happened on a quiet Tuesday night. Before I start telling you what happened, I need to give you a bit of context about the hotel where I worked, since that will make the story make more sense. Don't worry, the place was like those old, somewhat run-down hotels that appear in horror movies. You had the classic reception desk that faced the enormous parking lot with spaces right in front of the rooms. Although the hotel had 3 floors, they had warned me never to check anything on the 3rd floor due to a couple of strange situations that had happened before. But that's another story. Despite being able to describe the place as huge, from my desk I could actually see all the rooms. My only blind spot was some windows on the far side of the building. Well, back to the story. As I was saying, this happened on a quiet Tuesday that turned out to be one of those super slow nights for the hotel. Especially during the high tourist season, we normally had a quick flow of guests during the week and on weekends. But in the middle of winter, and with the hotel away from the main winter tourism routes, things got quieter. If someone managed to find us, they were generally a regular customer. That night, just after finishing a tour to check that the heating machines were working, I returned to reception and sat in the office behind the desk. I was about to put myself in paperwork organizing mode when I suddenly decided to take a look at the security camera screens. And there he was, a guy dressed in black standing just outside the reach of the windows, which seemed odd to me. Naturally, it made me curious, and I started watching him. The guy was there looking around as if he were searching for someone. I suppose when he thought he was alone, he pulled out a black ski mask from his pocket and put it on. At that moment, I didn't see that he was carrying a weapon, but I wasn't going to wait for him to pull one out either. So, with my heart at 1,000 beats per minute, I decided to run like crazy to close the main door before he could enter. I saw him through the windows as we both ran toward the doors, but I got there first and managed to turn the deadbolt just before his hand touched the knob. The mask he was wearing had a hole for the mouth, and as he approached, I noticed how a grimace of disgust formed on his face. Upon seeing him frustrated, my stupid and arrogant side decided to make fun of the situation. so I smiled at him in the most mocking way I could. But when he raised his hand and I saw the gun, that little smirk of smugness vanished from my face and was immediately replaced by an expression of pure fright. Although I couldn't see my own face, I did notice that the smile that appeared on his meant he had taken control. When his hand reached the height of my eyes, I saw the barrel of the pistol right between my eyebrows. At that moment, he pulled back the hammer, and the cylinder made a click. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. It was as if he were sealing his statement by pressing the barrel against the glass and placing his finger on the trigger. Seriously, at that instant I saw my life sliding before my eyes. Not much time had passed, and I felt like everything was ending. And yes, I wet myself, not completely, but enough to feel my pants damp. I'm not going to lie, it was a moment of pure panic. I thought about running away, but when I tried to move, I was totally paralyzed. So I just closed my eyes and waited for the shot that never came. I have no idea how much time I spent there, but when I finally found the courage to open my eyes, that guy was no longer there. My knees were about to give out, and I felt nausea rising in my throat. I took a few shaky steps and sat in the first chair I saw before collapsing. While I was hunched over with my head between my knees, struggling not to vomit, I wondered why I was alive. Did he take pity on me? I didn't even have the energy to think about it. I was just relieved to still be breathing. If I ever run into that guy in another situation, I'll definitely thank him for not pulling the trigger. The idea of calling the police crossed my mind, but I decided it wasn't worth it. Most likely they wouldn't be able to catch him, and besides, I couldn't describe him. So what I was going to do was change my pants, quit this horrible job, and listen to my parents. It was definitely time to go to college, after all. That was better than almost being killed by a random criminal. That night, I decided to finish my shift and quit the next morning. I told my boss about the attempted robbery and about the guy in the mask, just out of courtesy in case he decided to come back. That spring I enrolled in the local university. To this day, it seems somewhat crazy to me to think that despite the terror I felt that night, the incident ended up being the push I needed to get my life on the right track. I spent so much time in school that I wasn't in a hurry to get out of there. Plus, I saw how some of my friends were succeeding without ever having set foot in a university, and that had made me think that maybe college had nothing to offer me. But that night made it clear to me that I needed to learn an important lesson. Sometimes the most terrifying moments in our lives are the ones that force us to make the changes we've been avoiding. That man in the mask, whoever he was, unknowingly became the catalyst for the rest of my life. I never found out who he was or what he really wanted that night. Maybe he was just looking for quick cash, or maybe he had darker intentions. What I do know is that in that moment of absolute terror, when I thought my life was over, something inside me shifted permanently. I still drive past that old hotel sometimes. It's been converted into apartments now, but every time I see it, I remember that night and the strange gratitude I feel toward a man who held a gun to my head through a glass door and somehow gave me the motivation to build a better future. When I was younger, my mom always told me that fear was something you had to face, but if you couldn't, the best thing was to run. I never understood what she meant until a few months ago, when I found myself in a situation of pure terror. But before I tell you my nightmare story, let me introduce myself. My name is Laura, and after graduating high school, I was accepted to a university in another state. At that time, I was very excited to leave my parents' house behind. I couldn't stand their constant arguments and longed for the freedom of being in my own space and taking control of my life. I have to say that at first everything was going great. I felt freer than ever, but as time went on, I began to see the consequences of partying and enjoying myself without limits with friends. This made me neglect my classes, and I received warnings over and over again, until I was finally expelled for all the subjects I had failed. I never had the courage to tell my parents because I feared they would force me to come back home, and that was the last thing I wanted. Without a place to stay, I needed to find somewhere to live and a job to pay rent. So I got to it. I looked for work everywhere, and after several days of uncertainty, I ended up being a server at a Denny's restaurant in Springfield. It was my first job, and adapting to the routine cost me a bit, but I managed to get used to it. Although sometimes the customers were rude, and it exhausted me, I was generally happy with my new job. However, I didn't know that this experience, which seemed so great, would turn into a real nightmare. Everything happened a few months ago on a particularly busy day. That night, when closing time came, 3 of us stayed behind to finish up. One of them was an older man named Leonard. He honestly barely talked to anyone, but he always smiled and said thank you when we helped him. The other was Matt, a very skinny guy in his 30s who had dark bags under his eyes and a very unkempt appearance. He also smelled like a wet dog that had been hiding in a garbage can for weeks. Although he didn't mess with me or anything, his presence was unsettling since he was a talkative type who always told the same stories over and over again. As I said that night, just when we were closing, Matt approached me and started talking to me as if he were eager to tell me another one of his stories. Immediately, a wave of boredom washed over me, so I told him I had to go clean the restrooms, an excuse I used to get away from him. I went into the restroom just hoping to take a breather, because I didn't really need to clean them since I had done it a while ago. But it was the only place where I could get away from the chaos for a moment. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps approaching and then knocking on the door. It was Matt saying he was bored and wanted to talk. Frustrated, I replied that I was busy and why didn't he talk to Leonard instead? But he didn't seem to understand my discomfort. He just said that everyone knew Leo wasn't the type to make conversation. I tried to keep the conversation going with him, but it quickly bored me. I was still inside the restroom, and he started with his stories, but out of nowhere, the tone of his voice changed and became strange. Then he began talking about his intimate life, and I noticed how his voice was changing, and his breathing became heavy. I was completely disturbed, so I asked him to leave me alone. But then he responded with an almost demonic voice, suggesting he could show me how good he was in bed. At that moment, I got so scared that I screamed at him to leave me alone, and my voice echoed in the restroom. But after that, I heard banging as if he was trying to open the door. Luckily, I had the presence of mind and made sure to lock it. But that didn't take away the fact that this crazy guy was still trying to force his way in. I started crying and screaming for help. I shouted as loud as I could, hoping Leonard would come save me, but he didn't come, and I began to fear that he had left and that I was now alone with this maniac. But the worst was yet to come. After a while of struggling, Matt managed to break down the door. Suddenly, he stood in front of me, and his gaze was fixed on my body in a way that made me feel extremely uncomfortable. Suddenly, he smiled like a madman, and his eyes seemed about to pop out of their sockets. "Of course you want me to please you, honey," he said as he slowly approached. I was completely paralyzed, experiencing a fear that I had never felt before in my life. With no apparent escape, I prepared to defend myself however I could. But just then, I heard a crash like glass breaking, and when I looked behind Matt, I saw Leo with a broken bottle in his trembling hand. It was only at that moment that I realized Leonard had hit Matt in the head with the bottle, and although blood was flowing from the wound, he didn't seem to notice. Instead, he kept advancing, grabbing me with his bony hands. His grip was much stronger than I expected. I wanted to defend myself, but my body was completely paralyzed. I had never experienced anything like this in my life, so I was still in shock. I didn't know what to do. Leo jumped on Matt, trying to get him off me, but Matt pushed him so hard that Leo fell to the floor, hitting his head. I felt like I couldn't move a single muscle. Panic had me frozen, and when I thought all was lost, I remembered one of my mother's teachings: fight or run. Somehow that gave me the push I needed to get out of my state of paralysis. I managed to push Matt back hard, but he tried to grab me again. However, I struggled with him until I could break free and ran toward the exit. As I did, I heard police sirens and saw the blue and red lights flashing when the car arrived in front of the building. I felt incredibly relieved when I saw two officers running toward me. Although I was still stunned by what had just happened, tears began to flow from my tired eyes as I told them what had happened. Just then, one of them looked behind me and shouted that Matt was fleeing. I saw them run after him, disappearing into the darkness, and after a while, I heard gunshots. An officer came back and told me they had caught him. They had to shoot Matt 3 times before he fell to the ground. I told them that Leonard was inside, unconscious, and they ran into the restaurant. They came back shortly after, carrying Leo, who fortunately seemed to be okay. One of the officers explained to me that Leonard had called 911 as soon as he heard my screams, which had allowed them to arrive so quickly. I thanked Leo so much for that, and also the officers. I asked them what they knew about Matt, and they replied that considering how he resisted the shots, he was probably under the influence of some substance. The next day, I quit my job at Denny's. I called my parents and told them what had happened. My father was furious and demanded I come home immediately. Normally, that would bother me, but after what I had experienced, the idea of going back home with my family seemed very attractive. I don't know why Matt acted that way, but according to the police investigation, he was probably a drug addict with mental problems. Although I know he's dead now, I still wake up in the middle of the night seeing him in my nightmares, approaching and whispering, "Of course you want me to do it." My name is Casey, and every time I smell the sweet scent of pine needles after rain, it's like that weekend comes rushing back in its entirety. I had just turned 30 and was tangled up in a slow divorce, one of those soul-sucking ordeals that drain every ounce of your energy. That's when my grandmother called, her voice thick with emotion, asking for what seemed like a simple favor. Take a stack of papers to the county clerk's office that would secure her Social Security benefits. I'd been living in another state for some time, but the tremor in her voice left me no choice. I arrived on a Friday night, driving carefully through the winding mountain roads of rural Oregon. The old wooden house, lit only by kerosene lamps, still had that same creaking floorboard and the smell of burning wood from the kitchen stove. My tiny grandmother, tough as old leather, greeted me with a tight embrace. She explained that the clerk's office would only be open Monday morning, but the documents had to be there before noon, or the entire process would become complicated. On Saturday, I helped with chores, gathering firewood, washing dishes, tending the vegetable garden. The air was heavy from a distant wildfire, and by late afternoon, a thick fog descended over the forest. Grandma commented that this oppressive humidity was a bad omen, reminding her of times when strange things roamed the mountain trails. I laughed, thinking it was just the way old folks scared away boredom. In the early hours of Sunday, I woke startled by the lowing of a cow. I checked my watch and saw there was still a long time until dawn. The window was fogged over by the mist, and the yard lights seemed to float in the whiteness. Grandma was dozing in her rocking chair, the lamp wick flickering. I decided I'd leave before dawn to reach town early, drop the papers in a mail slot, and return in time for lunch. "You're going out in this darkness, child," she grumbled when she heard my footsteps on the floorboard. "The earlier I go, the better. You don't need to wait up for me." She sighed deeply and pulled a kerosene lantern from a cupboard. My cell phone was nearly dead because there was no signal up here, and she knew this. "Take the old trail. The light helps, and no animal likes the smell of the flame." I kissed her forehead, stuffed the documents into a plastic folder, and secured it across my body with the strap. I put on a light jacket, grabbed the lantern and a water bottle. The plan was simple. Follow a footpath that cut across the mountain ridge, cross the rusted footbridge of the old railway line, and descend to the paved road where the first bus usually passed. It would take at most 3 hours of walking. As soon as I left through the wooden gate, the world seemed swallowed by damp cotton. The yellow light from the lantern drew timid circles in the fog. The pine trees creaked, dripping resin. The air smelled of warm earth, as if the forest was breathing in silence. I walked unhurriedly, listening to the rustling foliage and my own heartbeat. After about a mile, the trail began climbing, narrowing between slippery rock slabs. Here the lantern helped little. The fog reflected the light and practically blinded me. I thought about turning back, but the idea of leaving my grandmother without her pension drove me forward. At the top of the slope, I found a straight path that led toward the footbridge. That's when I noticed a figure crouched at the edge of the path. It looked like a child, short, thin, head down, arms wrapped around its knees. I couldn't make out the colors of the clothing, only noticed it was covered by a brown crust so dry it cracked like old mud. I called out firmly, "Hey, are you hurt?" The figure raised its head, and beneath the matted hair clinging to its scalp emerged 2 large eyes without shine, opaque like frosted glass. There was no trace of fear, just a fixed, empty stare. I felt a chill but forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was someone lost, I thought. When I took a step, the child, assuming it was a child, stood up, creaking like a dry branch. I extended my free hand, but it didn't respond. Instead, it touched its own neck as if pointing, and opened its mouth. No sound came out, just a hoarse breath like wind escaping from old bellows. "Do you want help?" I asked, feeling the hair on my neck stand up. It shook its head slowly, then pointed toward the depths of the forest where the fog was thicker. It didn't seem to be shivering from cold. It appeared dried out, crackling. For a moment, I thought it might be a child's prank. But why would it be there alone at this hour? Suddenly, it advanced 2 dry, hard steps, dragging its left leg. The mud crust cracked, releasing dark dust that smelled of burned leaves. The lantern trembled in my hand. I started to back away, but my foot slipped on a wet stone. "Easy, I can take you back to the farm," I said. It raised its arm and stretched out fingers that seemed too long, touching the air as if feeling for smoke. On the broken nail of its thumb, I saw a strand of dried leather. Its chest contracted in a silent sob. Then, without warning, it made a low leap, grabbing my wrist that held the lantern. The flame swayed and almost went out. The touch was absurdly cold, almost livid, but the strength was that of an adult. I tried to break free, but it gripped tighter, tilting its face close to mine. The skin gave way, cracking to reveal darkened, muffled flesh like poorly burned wood. An acrid smell rose and made me recoil. "Let go," I screamed, trying to twist away. It didn't speak, just breathed in a dry wheeze like leaves being crushed. When I saw its other arm already pulling me by the folder strap, I thought about my grandmother's papers. If they tore or fell in the middle of the fog, goodbye pension. I gave a sharp pull but lost my balance and fell to my knees. The lantern rolled down the trail, leaving the flame weak. The child advanced, placing its hands on my shoulders. I felt the icy seam of its fingers pressing into my trapezius muscle with sharp pain. It brought its face closer, and then I realized it had no tongue. The darkness inside its mouth flickered like dying embers. With my free hand, I grabbed a handful of damp earth and threw it at its eyes. The crust on its face seemed to absorb the moisture, cracking louder. It recoiled with a muffled moan, but didn't let me go. I tried to scream for help, but everything around was fog and forest. I decided to kick its good leg. The impact was dry. I felt the mud crack and part of the shin give way, but without blood. It fell while still holding me, bringing me down with it. I rolled down the edge of the trail and hit my shoulder on an exposed root. In an act of desperation, I bit the wrist that gripped my jacket. The taste was of cold earth. It released me for a second. I took advantage, grabbed the lantern, twisted the wick to brighten the fire, and brought it close. The heat of the flame made the creature recoil with a sharp hiss, protecting its cracked face. I jumped up, ignoring the pain in my knee, and ran. I slipped, hit my toe on a stone, but kept going. The fog seemed like a living body, embracing and swallowing sounds. Behind me, I heard heavy, uneven footsteps and the same hiss of a punctured tire. Now and then, the lantern projected my deformed shadow on tree trunks, and I imagined another silhouette blending with mine. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably just minutes, I spotted the rusted structure of the footbridge erected over a narrow valley covered with tall grass. The metal beams creaked in the wind. I entered without thinking. The old wood of the main plank creaked low, betraying my weight. Down below, the valley was a sea of fog. In the middle of the crossing, the wind blew strong and almost extinguished the flame. I pressed the lantern against my chest to protect it. That's when I heard the distinct creak of a plank behind me. I looked over my shoulder. The creature was crouched at the entrance of the footbridge, swaying its head from side to side as if sniffing. The lantern emitted a crack. I held my breath, feeling the trembling in my calves. It advanced step by step, and each stride echoed on the hollow wood. I continued slowly, afraid of breaking some rotten plank. When I was just a few meters from the other side, I took a false step. The floor creaked loudly, and I felt the nail give way. I looked back. The creature was speeding up now, swinging its arms grotesquely like a bird preparing for flight. I closed my eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and ran as hard as I could. The planks groaned, but I didn't stop. At the end, a hill of red earth dropped toward the road. I jumped over the metal railing and rolled down the slope, scraping my elbows and shoulders. I heard the distant crash of breaking wood, followed by heavy silence. I lay there breathless, staring at the dim sky. The lantern had gone out in the fall. Only the smell of kerosene permeated my jacket. It took me a while to gather the strength to get up. My left ankle throbbed, probably sprained. Even so, I dragged myself up the slope to the abandoned train tracks that ran parallel to the road. Each step was a stab of pain, but the terror of seeing that mud child again propelled me forward. Sometime later, I can't say how long because the fog obscured everything, I heard the deep engine of an old truck. I waved my arms without thinking about how I must have looked. Dirty face, torn clothes, extinguished lantern hanging loose. The truck slowed and stopped, releasing a puff of compressed air. The driver opened the door big as a mountain, with thick, kind eyebrows. "What the hell happened?" he asked suspiciously. I told him between gasps that someone had attacked me on the trail. He didn't ask too many questions, just helped me up and offered a cup of water while shifting into first gear. I noticed he wore a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror. I pressed the folder with the papers against my chest. A miracle they were intact. I was dropped at the emergency clinic of a small town a few miles away. 2 nurses helped me. Diagnosis: injured ankle, various scrapes. I spent the night under observation. I tried to explain what I had faced. They mentioned trauma, hallucination. Only the night nurse, an elderly lady with silver hair, listened attentively without interrupting. When I finished, she made the sign of the cross and commented almost in a whisper. "They say that in these mountains, there's a traveler lost in the fog, dried from the inside until it becomes just mud and breath." On Monday morning, I called my grandmother, told her I was okay, and apologized for the scare. She cried on the other end of the line, but not from sadness. The papers reached the clerk's office on time, thanks to a health worker who did the favor of taking them there. I returned to the farm 3 weeks later, still limping. The footbridge was cordoned off. They said a section had collapsed in the fog early that morning. No body was found. That day, from the backyard, I looked toward the mountain ridge swallowed by the soft autumn mist, and felt my skin burn at the exact spot where the child had grabbed me. I still carry a small scar there, made of fine dots resembling ceramic cracks. They say my fear is all in my head when the mist rises on warm nights. But I swear I hear, very far away, a hoarse breath trying to steal the air again. It was around 1 o'clock in the morning when I was heading to my job at the McDonald's on 5th Street, ready to open the store with one of my favorite managers, Sophia. She had asked me to send her a message when I arrived so she could let me in. Since sometimes we had to be there much earlier than usual, if someone from the previous shift needed to leave early. Although that didn't happen frequently, I was prepared for any eventuality that morning. When I arrived, I noticed a man standing near the main entrance. His posture was unsettling. He had his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his leather jacket and was smoking a cigarette while staring intently into the interior of the restaurant. The rain was falling intensely that morning, soaking the ground, which made it even stranger that this guy wasn't taking shelter in his car and chose to stay outside, receiving the freezing raindrops. It was a strange scene, and I felt a chill in my stomach seeing his gaze fixed on the entrance, as if he were waiting impatiently for us to open. I parked as far away from him as possible since his presence made me nervous, and I sent Sophia a message to let her know I had arrived. To my relief, she appeared soon with an umbrella, and together we quickly crossed through the rain to the safety of the interior. "Good morning," I said with a smile, but she didn't seem as enthusiastic. Instead, she gave me a serious and hurried look, asking, "Did you see that guy outside?" I nodded, and we both wondered what someone like him would be doing out in the rain. The conversation drifted to the idea that maybe he was on drugs, trying to get some food before we opened at 5 a.m. As we began preparing the place, Sophia took care of refilling the sauces and organizing the napkins. Then she told me she would be in the back office if I needed her for anything. That was a relief, since I hoped to be able to concentrate on my tasks and forget for a moment about the disturbing presence of that man at the entrance. But the tranquility didn't last long, as Sophia called me from her office shortly after, asking me to come see the security cameras. I entered the office feeling somewhere between curious and worried. On the screen, we watched as the man outside was talking on his phone with a Spanish accent. He seemed to be commenting on something to someone. It's not common to hear that language around here, so it was a surprise for me. I only understood some of it, but didn't speak it fluently. Then something in the conversation caught my attention. With clear intention, the guy dropped a comment that chilled my blood. He said he knew that only Sophia and I would be working that early morning shift, and he was planning to grab us. When he finished the call, he pulled an object from his coat that looked like a large screwdriver. Our pulse quickened at that moment. I remembered Sophia's silent warning, "Don't open the door." Upon hearing knocking on the glass, she quickly picked up the phone to call the police, and I felt trapped in the tension of the situation. When I went out to the lobby, there he was, persistently banging on the glass door, something that made me increasingly anxious. I tried to signal for him to go away, explaining that we were closed, but he didn't seem to understand. His gaze was fixed on me, and his hands were hidden behind his back. I felt like I was in a bad dream as the banging echoed on the glass. His voice rose as he continued speaking in Spanish, so I could barely understand what he was saying. But what I did clearly understand at that moment was that he called me a bitch. And although I couldn't understand all of his words, the tone of his voice was threatening and full of rage. My heart was beating so hard I worried he could hear it. I should have felt more angry than scared, but there was something so disturbing about his presence that it froze me with terror. To my relief, the police arrived in less than 10 minutes, as if they had been waiting for a distress call. Upon seeing the officers, the man tried to run to his car, but his escape was brief. They tasered him before he could get far. Sophia and I watched helplessly from the entrance as they handcuffed him, and put him in the back of a patrol car. I remember his gaze was especially terrifying when he turned his head to look at me. There was an aura of anger, as if he knew we had thwarted his plan and was furious for not having succeeded. An officer approached shortly after to speak with Sophia, who was giving her statement. Meanwhile, the subject began lamenting in very rudimentary English, claiming he was just hungry and really just wanted to eat. But the things they found in his car, the screwdriver, the duct tape, and the chloroform, told a different story. That day, what had started as an ordinary early morning had transformed into a nightmare. That incident left me with a feeling of unease that didn't fade easily. I continued working at McDonald's for one more year after that encounter. But every time I arrived at the store at night, a part of me stayed alert, scanning everyone who passed nearby. Sophia always made sure I wasn't alone at the entrance, and I internally thanked her for her protection. Although the police promised to keep us informed about the situation, I never received more news about the guy. That night, I learned that there are people with extremely dark intentions who hide in the shadows, and we must always be alert. Without Sophia's help and the basic Spanish knowledge I learned from my stepmother, I'm sure things would have ended differently. Good evening. My name is Sarah, and I'm 27 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened about 2 months ago, but it feels like time itself has fractured. Part of me is still trapped in that night, while the other part, the one speaking to you now, lives with its echo. I never believed in ghosts or demons or any of those things people talk about. I wasn't raised to pray much, not like my grandmother. But after that night, I started believing that there are things we don't understand, and that the worst kind of evil isn't what you find on the streets. It's what you accidentally carry home with you. Everything in my life for the past 4 years has revolved around Grandma Rose. She had a massive stroke that left the entire left side of her body weakened. She can walk and talk, but with great difficulty, as if the world had become too heavy for her to carry. Before this, she was the most active person I knew. When I think of her before the stroke, the image that comes to mind is a sunny Sunday afternoon a few years back. We were at Coney Island Beach, her wearing that floral dress tied at the waist, running toward the water and laughing, calling my name. Her black hair didn't have a single gray strand then. She was movement, she was loud laughter, she was the smell of pancakes in the morning and fresh coffee brewing. Today, her world is our 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, the sound of the television, and the prayers she whispers with her wooden rosary beads between her fingers, the good fingers on her right side. And because of this, I became 2, 3, however many Sarahs were necessary. My routine was a silent marathon that began before sunrise. The first Sarah was the granddaughter. I'd wake at 5, make strong, bitter coffee, and go to her room. Grandma would already be awake, staring at the ceiling. I'd help her sit up, adjust her pillows. Breakfast was a ritual of patience. A slice of cantaloupe cut into tiny pieces that I'd bring to her mouth with a small spoon. "Tastes good, Grandma." "Yes, sweet girl, so good," she'd say, but her voice came out thick and tired. Sometimes a bit of fruit would dribble from the corner of her mouth, and I'd wipe it with a napkin, smiling as if it were the most normal thing in the world. It was in that smile that the lie began, the smile that said everything's fine, when nothing was fine. After breakfast came the second Sarah, the cleaning lady. I'd take the crowded bus that smelled of people and urgency to the wealthy part of the city. I cleaned 2 apartments belonging to people with money, where I scrubbed porcelain floors worth more than everything I owned. I cleaned mold from the corners of luxury bathrooms, dusted shelves full of hardcover books I'd never have time to read. One of my employers, a blonde woman who was always in workout clothes, had the habit of running her finger along furniture after I finished. Once she found a speck of dust and looked at me over her designer sunglasses, saying, "Sarah, dear, we need more attention to detail." I just smiled and said, "Yes, ma'am," while inside I felt a hot rage, wanting to tell her that the details of my life were far more complicated than a speck of dust. I'd return home at lunchtime, exhausted, the smell of bleach embedded in my hands. I'd make Grandma's lunch, give her medications at the right times, chat a bit about her soap opera. It was our moment. She'd tell me about the hero and the villain, and I'd pretend to care. "And you, dear?" she asked me one afternoon while I tucked the blanket around her legs. "Don't you think you're working too hard at that factory? You look so tired. Your eyes have such sadness." The air left my lungs for a second. Factory, the lie I had invented, night shift supervisor. It sounded important and respectable. My stomach churned. "Not at all, Grandma. It's normal tiredness. End of the month we produce more, but the money's good," I lied, forcing another smile. "So we don't have to struggle." She held my hand with her good hand. Her skin was soft and wrinkled. "You're a blessing, my dear, a blessing." Each word of love from her was a nail of guilt driven into my chest. I'd leave home for my second job with the echo of her voice in my head. The third Sarah worked afternoons at a diner downtown. The smell of grease stuck to my hair, my clothes, seeped into my pores. It was a constant flow of hurried people eating chicken wings standing at the counter, complaining that the coffee was cold. I cleaned the greasy griddle, swept floors covered with dirty napkins, and always smiled. The smile was my uniform, my mask. I counted the hours until my shift ended, until night fell. And I feared the night because when night truly came, the fourth Sarah appeared. One I didn't even know very well myself. I didn't go home. I'd take a cold shower in the tiny bathroom of the diner's break room, a cubicle that smelled of cheap disinfectant. I'd take off my uniform that reeked of rancid oil and put on other clothes, ones I kept at the bottom of an old backpack. Clothes that weren't mine, that belonged to this other person I had to become to survive. It was work that paid in one night what it took me a week to earn at the other 2 jobs combined. Money for rent, for Grandma's expensive medications, for the private physical therapy that made her fingers move a little better. Everything came from those hours. I'm not proud, but I'm not ashamed either. I have necessity. It was a service, an exchange, a body for a time, money for relief from the bills. But each car that stopped, each look that measured me from head to toe, each hand that touched me with the intimacy that money buys, tore a piece away from me. I felt hollow, dissociated, as if I left my body and floated on the ceiling, watching that woman who looked like me but wasn't me. It was the fourth Sarah, the one who smiled without joy, who agreed without listening, who felt disgust and called it routine. I'd return home in the early morning hours feeling an emptiness that wasn't hunger or sleepiness. It was a hole in my soul. And the worst part was entering the house on tiptoes and seeing the little light from the lamp in Grandma's room. She always waited for me, even while sleeping. and beside her bed, the image of Our Lady with her blue mantle seemed to judge me in silence. In those moments, I felt my body dirty, not on the outside, but inside. The night everything happened was one of those nights, a Tuesday. The air in New York was heavy, a humidity that promised rain but didn't deliver. The sky was cloudy, starless, and the city seemed to sweat. I had finished my last appointment. The guy was a tourist, spoke little, had a southern accent, complained about the heat, paid, and left. I was at the limit of exhaustion. My whole body ached. My feet inside high-heeled shoes that hurt me throbbed as if they had glass shards inside. The first thing I did was sit on the curb and check the rideshare app price. Ridiculous surge pricing. The fare was almost a third of what I had made that night. I looked at the numbers glowing on my phone screen and felt a dry, helpless rage. That money already had an owner. It was for the week's physical therapy sessions, for her blood pressure medications. It wasn't mine. I decided to walk. It hurt, but I was used to it. It would be about 25, maybe 30 minutes on foot. The route wasn't the best in the world. It passed through an area that was still developing, a frontier between the city and nothingness, full of empty lots and stalled construction projects, but it was the shortest way. I always did the same thing, took off my high heels, held them in my hand like an improvised weapon, and walked right down the middle of the street, away from the high walls, the shadows, the alleys where anything could hide. In the middle of the wet asphalt, I had the illusion that I was safe. If someone appeared, I'd have time to see, to scream, to run. The street was deserted. It was almost 3 in the morning. The only sound was my bare feet on the damp asphalt and the electric humming of the orange streetlights that gave everything a sickly, dreamlike color. The weak wind carried the smell of salt water mixed with something more rotten coming from the nearby marshes. A stray dog saw me pass, its eyes gleaming in the darkness, but it didn't bark. It just watched, as if I were just another ghost of the dawn. To my left ran a concrete drainage canal, a gray scar in the landscape. One of those they build so rainwater doesn't pool and become a mosquito breeding ground. It wasn't very deep, but it was wide. And the darkness inside it was total, a dense black that the streetlights couldn't penetrate. Water left over from the evening's rain still flowed there, making a constant sound, a peaceful gurgling. It was a normal sound, a city sound, until it stopped being normal. I stopped. I tilted my head trying to understand. The sound of water continued, but over it, mixed in, there was something else. A strange sound, sort of wet, bubbling. My tired mind tried to find an explanation. Trash, a plastic bag caught in the current making that weird sound, a clogged pipe. That's what it was. It had to be just that. But no, the sound had a rhythm, a cadence that seemed intentional. I kept walking, slower, ears alert, and then my tired mind began to shape the sound, to give it meaning. It wasn't an object. It was a sound that seemed like crying, low, muffled crying, as if it came from underwater. A child's whimper, weak and desperate. My whole body tensed. All the dangers I knew were human, drunks, crazy people, thieves. I knew how to deal with them, how to run, how to scream, how to defend myself. But this was different. My first rational thought was a cat, an animal trapped, drowning, but it wasn't a meow. The more I concentrated, the more the sound became unmistakably human, and it was a child. What could I do? Keep going, pretend I didn't hear, pick up the pace and leave whatever it was behind. But what if it really was a child who had fallen in there, a child who needed help? I'd never forgive myself. The image of my grandmother, so fragile, came to mind. What if it were her? With my heart beating irregularly in my chest, a mixture of fear and responsibility, I approached the edge of the canal. The smell rose strong, stagnant water, mud, and that sweet odor of rotting things. The street lighting didn't reach the bottom. It was just a dense darkness, a black hole. Is someone there? My voice came out more tremulous than I wanted, almost a whisper. No response, just that same sound, that bubbling, rhythmic lament. I swallowed hard, opened my purse, and got my phone. The screen lit up, illuminating my face for an instant. I took a deep breath and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light seemed weak against all that darkness. I pointed it down, sweeping the bottom of the canal. The light slid over the concrete dirty with slime, the dark water, and stopped. There was a figure there. It was crouched back to me. The flashlight revealed a small body curved in on itself, as if in great pain. It looked like a girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. She wore a light-colored little dress of thin fabric, now all dirty with mud and a dark grime that looked like grease. Her dark, long hair stuck to her back and neck. She was shivering, and the sound came from her, a cry that wasn't a real cry, more like a continuous, wet sob. The water around her was still, strangely motionless. A knot formed in my throat. My God, a child there in the middle of the night. "Hey, are you okay?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't move, I'm going to help you." The girl didn't respond with words. She just turned her head slowly toward my voice, like an animal trying to locate prey by sound. She didn't look at me, her head lifted, and her face became partially visible. And that's when I saw the eyes, or what should have been eyes. They were 2 spheres of pale blue, almost milky white, without pupil, without iris, like 2 smooth, opaque bird eggs. They seemed blind. I froze inside, a cold that had nothing to do with the night. That wasn't normal. "Did you fall in there? Did someone push you?" I asked, more to myself than to her, my voice a thread. She just shook her head from side to side in a movement that was too fast, spasmodic, inhuman. Her mouth was half open, and I could see her jaw moving slowly, as if she were chewing something hard, but there was nothing there. Her tongue passed over her lips in a slow, pasty way. It was a grotesque scene, wrong on every level. And then suddenly she stopped. Everything stopped. The crying, the trembling, the head shaking, the silence that followed was 1,000 times worse than the noise. I crouched at the edge of the canal with my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand, not knowing what to do. The world seemed to have held its breath. And she moved. She turned toward the concrete wall of the canal and began to climb. It wasn't like a person climbs. There was no effort, no search for support. Her hands and feet seemed to stick to the wall, and her body was propelled upward in a fluid, unnatural movement, like an insect, like a spider, slow, steady, silent, without a single sound. I dragged myself backward without being able to look away. My brain screamed for me to run, to disappear from there, but my body was paralyzed, nailed to the ground. She climbed until her head appeared at the edge of the street, right in front of me. My flashlight beam hit her face full on, and I saw. I really saw, and the image burned into my mind forever. The stature was of a child, the dress was of a child, but the face didn't belong to that body. The wrinkled, yellowish skin full of grooves seemed too old, stretched over a small skull. It was the face of death on a body that had barely begun to live. The air vanished from my lungs. The scream stuck in my throat, a mute whimper. I jumped up with my high heels still in my hand. She finished emerging from the canal with that smooth, horrifying movement and stood on the asphalt about 15 feet from me. The filthy dress dripped dark, stinking water on the ground. I took 2 steps back without courage to turn my back. Animal instinct said not to show my neck. What do you want?" The question came out as a torn whisper. She didn't answer. She just tilted her head to the side with that same fast, broken movement from before. And then she took a step in my direction, then another. And in an instant her posture changed. Her body curved forward, her thin arms hanging like an animal about to attack. And she made a sound. It wasn't the crying from before. It was a whistle, high and low at the same time. A sound that seemed to come from her throat and from everywhere around us. A sound that scraped the silence of the night. At that moment, the paralysis broke. I let out a dry scream and turned to run. I ran like I had never run in my life, with my shoes in my hand and terror giving me a strength I didn't know I had. I didn't look back, but I felt her. I heard her feet on the wet asphalt, a fast, inhuman rhythm that was approaching frighteningly. I felt her presence on my back, a cold that wasn't from the night air. I thought of Grandma, of her face, and I ran. I ran for my life. And then I felt the impact. A dead weight crashed against my back, throwing me forward. It wasn't like a child's embrace. It was heavy, dense, cold. Thin, hard arms like dry branches wrapped around my chest, squeezing me with incredible force, stealing my air. Her wet hair full of mud brushed against my neck, and a smell of damp earth and decomposition invaded my nose, making me gag. I screamed a scream of pure animal terror, a sound I didn't know I was capable of making. I struggled, trying to free myself from that weight. In desperation, I threw myself against the wall of a house under construction to my right. The impact of my body against the rough concrete wall was strong. The coarse texture of the cement scraped my back and arms. I hit once, twice, 3 times with all the strength I had, trying to crush whatever was clinging to me. The grip didn't loosen. I only felt those hard bones digging into my ribs, the weight suffocating me. Let me go. Help. Someone help me. That's when 2 shadows appeared at the end of the street. 2 men. They came running in my direction, shouting something I didn't understand. A cell phone flashlight danced in my direction. For a moment, I thought they were also seeing it, that they had come to save me from that thing. One of them, a stronger guy in a basketball jersey, grabbed me by the shoulders, his voice firm. "Miss, calm down, for God's sake. Stop this. You're going to hurt yourself." The other, thinner in work clothes, pointed his flashlight at my back at the wall everywhere. "Stop what? Get her off me. Get her off." I screamed, crying, still struggling, still feeling the weight on my back. The man holding me turned me to face him, shaking me lightly so I'd look at him. "Miss, look at me. Look, there's nobody here." I looked at him, confused, my brain short-circuiting. I looked over his shoulder at the wall. I looked at the empty street. The only thing there was us 3 under the orange light of the street lamps. The canal was silent. The street was deserted. There was no girl, no old woman's face, nothing. Those words hit me harder than the wall. I was alone. I was hitting myself against the wall alone. My desperate gaze swept the asphalt where I had fallen, where she had stood, Everything was dry. Not a drop of dirty water, no sign of mud. I looked at my arms, they were scratched, bleeding in some spots from the friction with the rough cement. My back burned terribly. House lights began to turn on. An elderly woman in a nightgown appeared at the window and shouted, "What are you doing to that girl? Leave her alone." "We're just helping, ma'am," one of the men replied. Still trembling, I could only say that I had felt sick, that I had a panic attack. They helped me call a taxi. During the entire trip home, I stayed huddled in the back seat, feeling a cold that wouldn't pass. I still felt the phantom weight on my back, the smell of mud in the taxi's air. The driver looked at me through the rearview mirror with suspicion. I entered the house in absolute silence. Grandma slept with her rosary in her hand. I went to my room and lay on the bed, fully clothed with the light on. I couldn't sleep. Every shadow in the room seemed to writhe. Every noise from the street was the sound of those feet on the asphalt. The next morning I looked at myself in the mirror and saw the scratches on my back and arms. They were real. The pain was real. That same day I made a decision. I went to Grandma's room, looked at her sleeping, and broke down in silent tears. I couldn't anymore. That money wasn't worth my soul, wasn't worth my sanity. I called the diner and quit. I never went back to that street. I never worked at night again. I got a third job cleaning the floor of a supermarket at dawn. The work is harder. The smell of wax and disinfectant makes me nauseous, and the money is much less. Life got tighter, but I prefer bodily fatigue to terror of the soul. But the story doesn't end there, because the problem is I think I didn't leave the canal child behind. I think I brought her with me. The consequence of that night infiltrated my daily life. I became a frightened person. The sound of water running down the shower drain gives me chills. A child's cry on the street gives me an anxiety attack, and I developed a deep fear of reflections. I covered the bathroom mirror with a towel. Grandma thought it was strange, but I said it was because the light reflected and bothered me while sleeping. Another lie, I can't face myself anymore. Sometimes when I'm very tired after a 12-hour shift, I look at myself in a dark surface and don't recognize myself properly. My face seems older, more furrowed, my eyes deeper. It happened again last week. I was in the living room, the television off, and Grandma was sleeping in her room. The house was silent except for the refrigerator's humming. I was sitting on the couch, just existing, too exhausted to think. I looked at the black TV screen and saw my reflection. And for a second that seemed to last an eternity, the face that looked back at me wasn't mine. It was an aged face, with pulled, yellowish skin full of creases, and the eyes were two pale, milky, empty spheres. The reflection on the screen tilted its head with that same fast, broken movement. And then the lipless mouth curved into a slow smile, a smile that didn't reach the dead eyes. I screamed and fell backward off the couch, my heart racing, beating in my throat. When I got the courage to look again over the upholstery, it was just me, Sarah, 27 years old, with a look of terror, but the image stayed burned in my head. The smile. Now I live with this doubt that is torture. That night in the canal, was I attacked by something supernatural that lives in the dark, something that fed on my fear and guilt and latched onto me? Or did the stress, exhaustion, and shame break something inside me? Was the creature I saw just the reflection of the ugliness I felt inside, the face of an old woman in a young body? Isn't that how I felt every day, spending my youth to sustain a lie? I don't know the answer, and that's the real terror. Not knowing if the monster is out there waiting at the next dark corner, or if it's in here, living behind my eyes, waiting for the next night of exhaustion to smile at me from the other side of the mirror. I had been working at Henderson and Associates, a small accounting firm in downtown Portland, for about 2 years. It was a relatively new company, so we only had between 12 and 18 employees at any given time. To be honest, the atmosphere wasn't exactly thrilling. Most of our days were spent hunched over our desks, crunching numbers and filling out endless reports. There wasn't much time for casual conversation or getting to know each other beyond work matters. However, that same office was where I met my girlfriend Sarah, who managed to bring some excitement to those otherwise monotonous days. The first several months passed without any significant events worth mentioning, other than my relationship with Sarah beginning to bloom, until this new guy joined our team. His name was Marcus, and from the very first moment I laid eyes on him, I knew there was something unsettling about him. He presented himself as a thin man with very little facial expression and an attitude that was far too reserved. He always kept himself apart from the rest of us, as if he had built an invisible wall around himself. Trying to maintain a conversation with him was nearly impossible, since he would only respond with monosyllables, or simply not answer at all. Sarah and I initially assumed he was just introverted, that maybe he had trouble socializing at first. However, his constant silences soon began to feel genuinely disturbing. As the weeks passed, I noticed that Marcus managed to go through entire workdays without interacting with anyone. Sarah, who always tried to get him to open up a little, felt frustrated by his constant lack of response. She tried talking to him several times, but he always seemed completely disinterested. Gradually, we observed that our workdays were becoming increasingly monotonous, since it was just Sarah, Marcus, and me in that section of the office. Sometimes the energy this guy brought was so heavy it seemed to crush our own spirits. However, despite the fact that he avoided both of us constantly, I couldn't help but notice the furtive glances he would throw Sarah's way from time to time. I remember one day in particular when we had a general meeting in the break room. I was sitting just to Sarah's left, and when I glanced over at him, I saw Marcus staring at her intensely. She was so absorbed in what our boss was saying that she didn't seem to notice that Marcus had his gaze fixed on her the entire time. But I saw it. It was strange and disturbing at the same time. I'm not a jealous man, and even though Sarah is genuinely beautiful and always draws attention, the truth is that the way he watched her gave me chills. I couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind with that fixed expression on his face. From that point on, I began watching him more carefully and paying closer attention to the things he did, but I didn't say anything to Sarah. I didn't want her to feel uncomfortable. Then came our boss's birthday. That afternoon, we gathered in the conference room to celebrate a little, and it was on that occasion that I finally managed to approach Marcus. He was standing in a corner, visibly uncomfortable, unable to become part of the conversation. At one point, I walked over and asked him how he was feeling, and he simply responded that he was fine without asking anything in return. Since I was obviously more intrigued than anxious about his response, I asked him a question that many would have considered harmless, but I had an ulterior motive. I said to him with a smile, "Hey, I've seen you looking at Sarah. Do you like any of the girls here?" His response was overwhelming silence. When I saw that several seconds passed without him saying anything, I laughed, trying to break the ice. "Come on, you don't have to hide it. I saw you looking at her." But as I said this, I noticed how his gaze shifted, avoiding me completely, before the color of his face changed subtly, as if he were hurt by my words. I realized that perhaps I had crossed a line, and I told him I was just joking. But he didn't even seem to hear me, remaining in his absolute silence. From that day on, I thought I had ruined any possibility of future conversation with him. Until 2 days later, something strange happened. One morning, while we were getting ready to go to work, Sarah noticed there was something in the microwave. When we opened it, we found a small clown doll. I looked at her, stunned, asking if it was hers. "I don't know where it came from," she responded with a confused expression on her face. We decided not to let it slide, and called the police to report this strange discovery, explaining that it seemed like someone had entered our apartment while we were sleeping and left that doll there. The police, after hearing our account, could only advise us to secure our locks and contact them again if anything else happened. "There's no crime and no damage," they said as they left. The next day when I arrived at the office, I noticed that Marcus wasn't there. He was never a master at the art of socializing, but that morning his absence made me uneasy, especially because he never missed work. It was strange. Later that afternoon, our boss came out of his office looking pale and suddenly dropped news on us that left us paralyzed. Marcus had been arrested. It turned out that our strange coworker had been accused of being responsible for the disappearance of a girl he had worked with at his previous job. Everyone in the office shared looks of confusion and concern. We were all wide-eyed and full of disbelief. Bewildered, I went home and decided to investigate. On an online forum, I found an article describing how Marcus had murdered his coworker 11 years ago when he had worked at a traveling carnival. The news said that his apartment was filled with clown dolls, a fact that chilled my blood when I read it. Even more disturbing, it mentioned that they had found photographs of several women on his computer who were presumably his possible next victims. I prayed that those photos didn't include Sarah. That day was a crushing blow. I felt inexplicably relieved that this madman was no longer a danger in our lives. Sarah and I talked about how grateful we were that they had caught him. And I believe that if it hadn't been for his arrest, that strange fixation he had with her could have had terrifyingly dark endings. Not only did my job change that day, but also my perception of the people around me. I realized that sometimes a person's true face is hidden behind a mask that we can't always see. Now, every time I look around, especially in lonely places or situations that seem normal, I think about Marcus. Human cruelty can manifest in ways we never imagine, and we must always stay vigilant. Good evening. My name is Vincent. Today I'm 56 years old, but the story I need to tell happened about 6 years ago, when I had just turned 50. 50 years old is an age that weighs heavy. For me, it weighed more than I imagined. All my life I had worked as an industrial mechanic technician at a large manufacturing plant here in Detroit. It was a noisy, hot factory floor, but it was my place. I had my worth, my union card since I was 18, and a fierce pride in never letting my family lack for anything. I understood machines, gears, how things worked, and suddenly the machines changed. Automation came with everything, and my experience, my decades of knowledge, turned to dust. I was one of many the company restructured, a nice way of saying I was no longer useful. The severance was deep. You always think you're prepared for life's tumbles, but you're not. Never are. My wife Martha was my pillar as always, but I saw the worry in her eyes. My kids, already adults with their own lives, tried to help, sending me job listings they found online, but nothing seemed to fit. They were positions that required fluent Spanish, master's degrees, proficiency in software I didn't even know existed. I felt like a ghost in the modern world, an analog man in a digital age. After almost a year living off unemployment and savings that were drying up, desperation knocked on the door. That's when an acquaintance mentioned a job opening for a night security guard. The salary was little more than minimum wage. The schedule was 12 hours on, 36 off, but it was steady work. It was a chance to feel useful again, to bring home money that wasn't from a government benefit. The place was the Northland Shopping Center. At least that was its name in the 90s, in its heyday. When I went for the interview, I felt a knot in my stomach. That place had been the scene of some of the best days of my life. I had taken Martha there on our first real date, to the movie theater on the top floor. We ate at the McDonald's in the food court, me all awkward, her laughing at my clumsy ways. It was there we bought our oldest son's first video game system, our youngest daughter's first doll. That mall pulsed with life. It was an illuminated giant, noisy, full of people, shopping bags, music. Now the giant was dying. Arriving there for the interview was like visiting a sick relative in the hospital. The facade, once imposing, was faded. Many of the ground floor stores had plywood where the storefronts used to be. The food court that was always packed had only 3 or 4 little restaurants open with dim lights, looking like islands in an ocean of empty tables and chairs. The movie theater had closed more than a decade ago. I was hired. My job was simple: make periodic rounds throughout the entire building during the night, from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. I was the only guard on shift. Before, there were 2, but with the mall increasingly empty, they cut costs. I received a walkie-talkie that crackled more than it talked, a powerful flashlight, and a set of keys that seemed to weigh about 10 pounds. My base was a tiny room near the administration office, with a monitor showing images from a few cameras still working. The first weeks were filled with a loneliness I had never felt. It was a different loneliness from being unemployed at home. At home I had Martha, the TV noise, life happening outside. In the mall, it was silence. A heavy, thick silence that seemed to have form. Silence filled only by the distant humming of some generator, and the echo of my own footsteps on the polished granite corridors. I walked through those dark walkways, illuminating the dusty storefronts with my flashlight. Stores that once sold middle-class dreams were now tombs of headless mannequins covered by a shroud of dust. In an old department store, you could still see the faded mark on the carpet where the cash registers used to be. I remembered being there with Martha, choosing a wedding gift. Those walls knew more about my history than many people, and seeing them like that, abandoned, was like looking at an aged and forgotten portrait of myself in a drawer. The pain of my own obsolescence was impregnated in every corner of that place. The mall and I, we were aging and dying together. Sometimes when melancholy hit hard, I'd call Martha. "Hi, honey, everything okay there?" "Everything's fine, Vincent. How about there?" "All quiet, too quiet even. Just me and the ghosts of what this place used to be." We'd laugh, but it was humorless laughter. The other employees, the cleaning and maintenance folks, had their stories. It was the usual talk in places like this. They said the bathroom doors on the second floor slammed by themselves, that sometimes the lights in an entire corridor would flicker for no reason. Bad wiring, I thought. The most recurring story was about Mrs. Catherine, a cleaning lady who had been there for about 20 years. One night when I was arriving for my shift, I met her at the employee exit. She looked more tired than usual. "Everything peaceful, Mrs. Catherine." "Everything, Vincent. Just the usual, the place talking to itself." Talking, she stopped, looked around as if checking whether we were alone, and lowered her voice. "The women's bathroom at the back, near the closed wing." I went to get my supplies that I'd left there. The door was locked from the inside. I called out, thought it was some late customer, but nobody answered. When I was about to give up, I heard it. Heard what? A little song. It sounded like a child's music box, very soft, a silly little melody. I stood there listening. After about a minute it stopped and the door unlocked with a click. I opened it slowly. Nobody there, no sign of anyone. I thanked her, wished her good rest, and stood there watching her walk away. Music box. My mind, of course, went straight to a logical explanation. The sound could have come from some forgotten cell phone, an old toy that turned on by itself. But the image stayed with me. The nights dragged on. I got used to the creaking of the building's structure, to the sound of wind whistling through the cracks. I started naming the sounds so I wouldn't go crazy. The talk was an air conditioning duct contracting. The scraping was possibly some rat in the ceiling. But then I started hearing things that had no names. Footsteps, light footsteps, almost a whisper on the floor above when I was absolutely certain I was alone in the building. One night I was in my room, it was about 2 a.m. Fatigue caught up with me, and I must have dozed in the chair for a few minutes. I woke with a start, not knowing why. My heart was beating a little faster. I decided to make a round to wake up. I grabbed my flashlight and left. Instead of following my usual route, something pulled me toward the north wing of the second floor. It was the deadest part of the mall. All the stores closed, most with those tempered glass doors locked with chains and heavy padlocks. The silence there was even deeper. My flashlight was the only thing cutting through the darkness, making the dust dance in the air. That's when I heard it. It was so low that for a moment I thought it was ringing in my ears, but no. It was a melody of few notes, repetitive and childlike, a music box. My blood seemed to thicken. I froze inside. I remembered Mrs. Catherine. My first reaction was anger. Some idiot must have broken into the mall to play a prank. But how? All the entrances were locked, the alarms were on. I followed the sound. It came from one of the last stores in the corridor, an old women's boutique. The storefront was covered with dust inside. You could barely see the interior. And then, along with the music, I heard another sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the store's glass door. I approached slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The door vibrated slightly with each tap. I shone my flashlight on the glass. From the other side, in the store's darkness, a figure materialized. It was an elderly woman, a very thin old lady with white, sparse hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore something that looked like a hospital gown or an old nightdress in a light color. Her hands were pressed against the glass, and it was she who was tapping with her palm, without force. Her face was in shadow, but I could see her eyes fixed on me. The music box stopped. The only sound now was my breathing and my flashlight's humming. The padlock on the door was intact, the chain taut. It was impossible for someone to have gotten in there. "Ma'am, are you okay? How did you get in there?" She didn't answer, just stared at me. Her gaze was confused, lost. She said something, but her voice was so low, muffled by the glass, that I didn't understand. It seemed like a murmur. She gestured toward the lock. "Open, please." The voice was weak, ancient. "I don't have the key to this store, ma'am. I'll call my supervisor. Do you need help?" She shook her head negatively. Her gaze began to change. The confusion gave way to irritation, impatience. "I don't want to stay here. Open." She started pushing the door harder. The glass trembled and the metal chain clinked, echoing through the empty corridor. With each push, a loud clank. I was terrified, but my job was to help. Maybe she was a homeless person who found a way in and got trapped. An elderly woman having an episode. I needed to do something. I grabbed my radio. "Mr. Henderson, come in. Over. Copy, Vincent. Did something happen? Over." "Mr. Henderson, I'm in the north wing of the second floor. There's a lady trapped inside the old Amelia's boutique. She seems disoriented. The padlock's intact. I don't know how she got in, but she's asking to get out. Over." There was silence on the other end. A pause. "A lady in there. Are you sure, Vincent?" Over. "Yes, Mr. Henderson. I can see her. She's forcing the door. I think I'll have to break the padlock. Is there any heavy tool in the security room, a crowbar, something like that?" Over. Another pause. I could hear his breathing through the radio. "Vincent, that store's been closed for more than 10 years. But if there's someone there, we need to get them out. In the big toolbox under the counter, there's a large bolt cutter. See if it works, but be careful. Over and out." I looked at the woman. She continued staring at me, now with an empty expression, her face without any emotion. I ran like I hadn't run in years. My footsteps echoed desperately through the silent mall. Fear gave me energy I didn't know I had. I arrived breathless at the security room, threw things from the counter to the floor, found the toolbox, and grabbed the bolt cutter, which was heavy as hell. I ran back. The return trip seemed longer. The sound of my feet on the floor was the only thing I heard. When I turned the last corner, I slowed down, trying to control my breathing. I pointed my flashlight at the store door, and my entire body froze. The store was empty. The flashlight swept the dusty interior and revealed nothing but metal clothing racks and a fallen counter. The woman was no longer there. My first thought was relief. Maybe she had found another exit. Maybe she had hidden in the back of the store. That's when I lowered the light beam and saw her. She was in the corridor outside, about 30 feet away from me, standing in the middle of the walkway. But she wasn't simply standing. She was hunched over, her body bent forward at an angle that didn't seem natural, as if her spine were made of rubber. Her arms hung long and loose, her hands almost touching the floor. Her head was down, the white hair falling over her face, hiding it completely. There was no scream, no shock. What came was a cold sensation, an absolute certainty that what I was seeing didn't belong to this world, wasn't human. The paradox of the situation invaded my brain and broke it. She was in there, locked. Now she was out here, without noise, without a broken door, without logic. I don't know how long I stood paralyzed, looking at that twisted, motionless form in the darkness. A second, a minute, time stopped making sense. The only thing my body knew how to do was turn around. I didn't run. I walked fast, but without running, one step after another, forcing my legs to move, to take me away from there. I didn't look back. I had a primal, childish fear that if I looked, she'd be right behind me. I reached my room and locked the door. My hands shook so much I could barely turn the key. I sat in the chair and kept looking at the camera monitor. Nothing. Empty corridors, closed doors. I grabbed my cell phone, dialed Martha's number. "Vincent, did something happen? It's 3:30 in the morning." No, honey. Sorry to wake you. I just wanted to hear your voice." I needed to hear the voice of someone alive, someone real. I finished my shift locked in that room. The sun never took so long to rise. When daylight came and the first cleaning employee arrived, I felt safe to leave. I went home with my body aching, my head exploding. I had a fever all day. Every time I closed my eyes, the image came back. The woman hunched in the middle of the corridor, the way her arms hung, that silence. I didn't tell Martha, didn't tell anyone. Who would believe it? They'd say I slept and dreamed, that stress played a trick on me. And for days I tried to convince myself of that, but the sensation I had in my chest when I saw her, wasn't from someone who saw an illusion. It was the sensation of having looked at something that shouldn't exist. But the story didn't end there. After days of fever and nightmares, I realized that fear had transformed into a sick obsession. The normal thing would be to quit, never set foot in that place again. But I didn't do that. Something changed inside me. I needed to understand. On my days off, I spent hours on the internet researching the Northland Shopping Center, stories, old news, anything. After weeks of digging through digitized newspaper archives, I found an article from a local newspaper from about 15 years ago. The headline was "End of an Era. Traditional shop owners resist Northland Center crisis." The article talked about the mall's decline and interviewed some of the oldest store owners. And there she was, a low-quality black and white photo of an elderly woman with a bun, smiling behind a counter. The caption read, "Amelia Guzman, owner of Amelia's Fashions for 30 years, states, 'I'll only leave here dead. This store is my life.'" Amelia, the name Mr. Henderson had mentioned on the radio, the old Amelia store. My blood ran cold. I kept searching and found her obituary from a few years after the article. She had died at home of natural causes at 82, alone. The store had been closed by mall management for non-payment shortly before. Since then, it had remained empty. Since then, my work changed. The rounds are no longer an obligation, they're a search. Every night I pass through that corridor. Sometimes I think I hear the music box again. Other times I smell a sweet, old-fashioned perfume in the air. I never saw her again, but I keep looking. I walk through those dark corridors and know I'm not alone. The mall is no longer a mirror of my pain. Now it's her place, and I'm the guard, not of the stores, not of the building. I'm the guardian of her memory. And sometimes, in the loneliness of dawn, I wonder who's more trapped here. Her in her ghost store, or me in this job, in this 56-year-old body haunted not just by a ghost, but by the certainty that in the end, we all run the risk of becoming obsolete and forgotten, just an echo in an empty corridor. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.